The rain is tapping softly against the windows, and you're here, which likely means sleep hasn't been cooperating. That's okay. Nights like this can feel long and heavy, but you don't have to move through them alone. Let me tell you 5 quiet stories while the rain keeps falling. All you need to do is listen. Story 1, the dog that barked at my empty hallway. My dog saved my life. I need to say that up front because everything that follows might sound like I'm complaining about him, and I'm not. Duke is the reason I'm still here. He knew something was wrong long before I did, and he tried to tell me in the only way he could. I just didn't listen. Duke is a German Shepherd mix I adopted from a shelter about 3 years ago. He was 2 when I got him, already trained, calm for his breed, the kind of dog who'd rather lie at your feet than tear around the house. The shelter said his previous owner had passed away, and Duke had spent 2 weeks alone in the house before anyone found him. I think that experience did something to him, made him watchful, protective, hyper-aware of his surroundings in a way that other dogs aren't. He always seemed to be monitoring things, keeping track of sounds and movements, making sure everything was as it should be. For the first 2.5 years, that vigilance was never a problem. Duke would alert me when someone came to the door, settle down once he realized it was just the mailman or a delivery driver, and go back to his spot on the living room rug. He barked at squirrels in the backyard, and occasionally at cars that drove by too slowly, but never at nothing. Never without a reason. Then I moved into the house on Brenner Street, and everything changed. I was 29 at the time, single, working as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. I'd been renting apartments since college, but I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on something of my own. The house was a small 2-story in an older neighborhood, built in the 1940s, updated enough to be livable, cheap enough to be affordable on my salary. It had good bones, the realtor said, character, potential. What it also had was a long, narrow hallway on the 2nd floor, 3 doors branching off it, master bedroom at the end, spare room on the left, bathroom on the right. The hallway was maybe 15 feet long, just wide enough for one person, with hardwood floors that creaked no matter how carefully you stepped. At night, with the lights off, it was the darkest part of the house. No windows, no natural light, just this tunnel of shadow connecting the stairs to the bedrooms. Duke hated that hallway from the first day we moved in. I noticed it during our initial walkthrough, before I'd even signed the papers. The realtor was showing me the upstairs, pointing out the original crown molding and the updated bathroom fixtures, and Duke was right there with us, like he always was. But when we reached the hallway, he stopped, planted his feet at the top of the stairs, and refused to go any further. His ears were flat against his head, his tail tucked low, and he was making this sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Something in between. He probably just needs to get used to the new space, the realtor said. Dogs can be funny about unfamiliar places. I believed her. Duke had never lived in a house before, only apartments with their contained spaces and predictable layouts. A 2-story home with stairs and multiple rooms was new territory for him. Of course he was nervous. He'd adjust. He didn't adjust. The first few weeks in the house, Duke refused to go upstairs at all. I'd call him at bedtime, pat the mattress, offer treats, and he'd just stand at the bottom of the stairs looking up at me with those big brown eyes. Eventually I gave up and let him sleep in the living room, figuring he'd come around when he was ready. Then, about a month after we moved in, he started coming upstairs, but only to bark at the hallway. It would happen around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'd be dead asleep, buried under my covers, and suddenly Duke would be at the top of the stairs, barking his head off at absolutely nothing. I'd stumble out of bed, turn on the hall light, and find him standing rigid at the threshold, staring into the empty corridor like he was facing down an intruder. There was never anything there. No sounds, no shadows, no explanation. Just an empty hallway and a dog who was convinced something was wrong. I took him to the vet after the 3rd time it happened. She examined him thoroughly, ran some tests, asked about his diet and exercise routine. Everything came back normal. Healthy dog, no issues. She suggested it might be behavioral, stress from the move, maybe, or some sound in the house that was bothering him at a frequency I couldn't hear. Old houses make all kinds of noises, she said. Pipes settling, wood expanding and contracting. He might be picking up on something you're not aware of. That made sense. Old house, unfamiliar sounds, sensitive dog. I bought some calming supplements, played soft music at night, tried to create a more soothing environment. For a week or so, it seemed to help. Duke still wouldn't walk down the hallway, but at least he stopped barking in the middle of the night. And then I found the first footprint. I was vacuuming the spare room, the one I'd been using for storage, boxes still unpacked from the move, when I noticed a mark on the hardwood floor near the closet. A dusty outline, smudged but distinct. The shape of a shoe, a man's shoe from the size of it, much bigger than anything I owned. I stood there staring at it, vacuum still running, trying to come up with an explanation. The movers, maybe, or the home inspector. Someone who'd been in the house before I moved in, whose footprint had just been sitting there unnoticed until now. But the spare room closet had been closed since the day I moved in. I hadn't opened it once. There was no reason for anyone's footprint to be right there, right in front of that door, unless someone had opened it recently, unless someone had been in my house. I tried to talk myself out of it. Stood there in the spare room running through every possible explanation, every innocent reason why a footprint might be in front of a closet I'd never opened. The previous owners. A contractor who'd done work before I bought the place, someone from the home inspection I'd forgotten about. It didn't have to mean anything sinister. But Duke had been barking at the hallway for weeks. Duke had known something was wrong from the very first day. I opened the closet. It was empty. Just bare walls and a wooden rod for hanging clothes, a shelf above it with nothing on it. The floor was dusty, undisturbed except for that one footprint near the door. I don't know what I expected to find. A person crouched in the corner, a message scrawled on the walls. There was nothing, just emptiness and dust and the faint, musty smell of a space that hadn't been aired out in months. I closed the door and backed out of the room. Told myself I was being ridiculous. Went downstairs and poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch with Duke's head in my lap, trying to calm down. That night, Duke barked at the hallway again. 2:47 a.m., according to my phone. I lay in bed listening to him, that urgent, insistent bark that I'd been dismissing as behavioral issues. And for the first time, I really heard what he was trying to tell me. Something was wrong in that hallway, something I couldn't see but he could sense, and I'd been ignoring him for weeks. The next morning, I called a locksmith. Had him change every lock in the house, front door and back, even the deadbolt on the side entrance I never used. I watched him work and asked if he noticed anything unusual about the existing locks, signs of tampering, scratches that might indicate picking. He said they looked fine to me, normal wear and tear for a house this age, nothing suspicious. I didn't feel better. I started paying attention to things I'd overlooked before. The way the back door sometimes felt slightly loose in its frame, like it didn't quite seal properly. The window in the spare room that I could have sworn I'd locked, but found unlocked one afternoon. The creaking in the hallway at night that I'd attributed to old wood, but now wondered if it might be something else. Someone else. Duke's behavior got worse. He wouldn't go near the upstairs at all anymore, not even to bark. He'd stand at the bottom of the stairs and whine, this high-pitched, anxious sound that set my teeth on edge. When I came down in the morning, he'd sniff me frantically, like he was checking to make sure I was okay, like he'd spent all night worrying about me up there alone. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, started keeping my phone on my nightstand with 911 ready to dial, started lying awake for hours, listening for sounds in the hallway, straining to hear anything that might explain why my dog was so afraid. 2 weeks after I found the footprint, I found something else. I'd been cleaning the master bedroom, moving furniture to vacuum behind it, when I noticed marks on the wall behind my headboard. Light scratches, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. At first, I thought it was just wear from the bed frame rubbing against the wall. Then I looked closer. They were tally marks, 5 vertical lines crossed through with a diagonal. One set, then another, then another. I counted them with shaking hands. 23. 23 tally marks scratched into the wall behind my bed. In a room where I'd been sleeping for almost 2 months. I didn't understand what they meant. Didn't want to understand. But something about those marks, the careful spacing, the deliberate scratches, made my stomach turn inside out. Someone had made them. Someone had stood in my bedroom, probably while I was asleep, and marked the wall like they were counting something. Counting what? Visits? Nights? How many times they'd watched me sleep? I called the police. They sent an officer out, a tired-looking woman who took pictures of the tally marks and the footprint and made notes in a little pad. She asked if anything was missing, if I had any enemies, if I'd noticed anyone suspicious in the neighborhood. I said no to everything. She said they'd increase patrols in the area, told me to call if anything else happened, and left. That night, I didn't sleep upstairs. I brought my pillow and blanket down to the living room and lay on the couch with Duke pressed against my side. His warm weight the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. Every sound made me flinch, the house settling, the wind against the windows, the faint creak of wood from somewhere above us. Duke heard it too. His ears would perk up, his body would go tense, and he'd stare at the ceiling like he could see through it to whatever was making the noise. But he didn't bark. He just watched and waited and stayed close to me like he was standing guard. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps, not creaking, not settling. Footsteps, distinct and deliberate, moving down the upstairs hallway toward my bedroom. I sat up on the couch, heart pounding, and Duke was already on his feet, a low growl building in his throat. The footsteps stopped, right above the living room, right where my bedroom door would be. Then silence, long and heavy and absolute. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there in the dark with my hand on Duke's collar, waiting for something to happen, waiting for whoever was up there to come down the stairs and find me. Nothing happened. The footsteps didn't resume. The house stayed quiet. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside the windows, and I realized I'd been sitting frozen on that couch for almost 4 hours. When the sun was fully up, I made myself go upstairs, made myself walk down that hallway Duke had been warning me about for months. My bedroom door was closed, the way I'd left it, but when I opened it, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The window was open, wide open, curtains drifting in the morning breeze. I never opened that window. I never even unlocked it. Someone had been in my room last night, and they'd left the same way they came in. I didn't stay in that house another night. Packed a bag, loaded Duke into my car, and drove to my sister's place across town. She thought I was overreacting at first. Old houses make noises. Maybe I'd opened the window and forgotten. But when I showed her the pictures on my phone, the tally marks and the footprint in that gaping window, her face went pale. "You need to call the police again," she said. "This is serious." I did. Different officers this time, a detective who actually seemed to take me seriously. He came to the house with a forensics team, dusted for prints, examined the window and the locks and every possible point of entry. They found fingerprints that didn't match mine on the window frame, partial shoe prints in the flower bed outside, consistent with someone climbing up to the second floor using the old trellis that ran up the side of the house. "Someone's definitely been getting in," the detective confirmed. "We'll run the prints through the system, see if we get a hit." I stayed at my sister's for 3 days, sleeping on her guest bed with Duke curled up on the floor beside me. Even there, in a house that wasn't mine, in a neighborhood where no one knew me, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about those tally marks, 23 of them. 23 times someone had stood in my bedroom while I slept, close enough to touch me, and I'd never known. The thought made my skin crawl so badly I wanted to tear it off. The detective called on the fourth day. They'd gotten a match on the fingerprints. His name was Carl Richter, 42 years old, lived about 6 blocks from my house. He had a record, nothing violent, mostly petty stuff. Theft, trespassing, a peeping Tom charge from 8 years ago that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor. He'd done 90 days for that one, then dropped off the radar. No arrests since, no complaints filed. He's been clean for years, the detective said, at least as far as we knew. But he hadn't been clean. He'd just gotten better at not getting caught. The police picked him up that afternoon at his apartment. They found more there, photographs, hundreds of them, printed out and organized in binders. Women in their homes, taken through windows, taken from angles that made it clear the subjects had no idea they were being watched. Some of the photos were of me, in my kitchen making coffee, in my living room watching TV, in my bedroom, asleep, the covers pulled up to my chin. He'd been photographing me for months, since before I even moved in, the detective said. He'd been watching the house while it was on the market, had seen me during the open house, and had decided I was going to be his next project. Project. That's what he called it in the journal they found. His projects, the women he watched, the routines he memorized, the homes he learned to enter without leaving a trace. I was Project 17. The number matched the order in which he'd started watching me, not the tally marks on my wall. Those were something else. Those counted the nights he'd actually been inside while I slept. 23 times he'd climbed through my window, walked down my hallway, and stood in my bedroom watching me sleep. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. He wrote about it in his journal. How peaceful I looked, how he liked the way I breathed, how he imagined what it would be like to touch me. He never did, not once, according to him. He just watched. Like that made it okay. Like that made him something other than what he was. The detective told me they'd also found a key to my house in his apartment. Not a copy, my actual spare key, the one I kept hidden under a fake rock by the back door. I'd put it there the week I moved in case I ever locked myself out. I'd never told anyone about it. He must have watched me hide it, then taken it at some point when I wasn't home. That's how he got in at first, before I changed the locks. After that, he switched to the window. Found a new way in because I'd blocked the old one. Adapted. Evolved. Like this was a game, and every obstacle I put up was just another puzzle for him to solve. Duke had known. From the very first day, Duke had sensed that something was wrong with that house, that hallway, that room where a stranger had been coming to watch me sleep. He'd tried to warn me over and over, and I'd taken him to the vet, given him calming supplements, dismissed his behavior as anxiety from the move. I'd ignored the one alarm system that actually worked. I went to see Carl Richter's apartment after the police cleared out. I don't know why, morbid curiosity maybe, or some need to understand how this had happened. The building manager let me stand in the doorway and look inside. It was ordinary, painfully, disturbingly ordinary. A couch, a TV, a small kitchen with dishes in the sink. Nothing that would tell you a predator lived there. Nothing that would warn you to stay away. He'd walked past me on the street, probably. We'd maybe been in the same grocery store, the same coffee shop, the same spaces where normal people live their normal lives. And the whole time, he'd been watching, planning, waiting for his chance to get close. The trial was set for 4 months out. Carl Richter was denied bail. The photographs were too damning, the journal too detailed. He'd sit in a cell until his day in court, and then, hopefully, for a long time after. But I couldn't wait 4 months to feel safe. I couldn't live in limbo, couldn't keep sleeping on my sister's guest bed, couldn't put my life on hold while the legal system slowly ground toward justice. I had to go back to that house, had to reclaim it, or sell it, or do something. I couldn't just leave it there, full of his fingerprints and his photographs and the memory of 23 nights I'd never get back. So on a cold Saturday morning, with Duke by my side and my sister waiting in the car outside, I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, still. The morning light coming through the windows made it look almost peaceful, almost like a home instead of a crime scene. Then Duke started growling. He was staring at the stairs, that same rigid posture I'd seen so many times before, ears flat, hackles raised, a low rumble building in his chest. I felt my heart stutter. Carl Richter was in jail. I'd watched the detective confirm it myself. There was no one here. There couldn't be anyone here. But Duke had never been wrong, not once. "Stay here," I whispered, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I pulled out my phone, texted my sister. "Something's wrong. Duke is growling. Call police if I don't come out in 5 minutes." Then I started up the stairs. The hallway looked the same as always, narrow, dark, that tunnel of shadow I'd grown to dread. The door to the spare room was closed. The bathroom door was open. My bedroom door, at the end of the hall, was also open, exactly how I'd left it when I'd fled days ago. Duke was behind me now, still growling, pressed against my legs like he was trying to herd me back downstairs. I ignored him. I had to see, had to know. I checked the spare room first. Empty. The closet where I'd found the footprint. Empty. The bathroom. Empty. Everything looked undisturbed, coated in a thin layer of dust from the forensics team's work. Then I got to the bedroom. The window was closed now. The police had shut it after processing the scene. My bed was still unmade, sheets tangled from the last night I'd slept here before I knew what was happening. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the ceiling. I don't know what made me look up. Instinct, maybe. Or the way Duke's growl shifted in pitch when I stepped into the room, becoming higher and more urgent. But I looked up, and I saw it. A seam in the ceiling that I'd never noticed before. A rectangular outline, barely visible, painted over to match the rest of the surface. An attic access panel, right above my bed. My legs went weak. I grabbed the door frame to steady myself, staring at that rectangle, thinking about all the nights I'd slept directly beneath it. Thinking about how Carl Richter had climbed through the window 23 times. Thinking about how he'd never mentioned an attic in his journal, never talked about anything except the window, because maybe the attic wasn't his. I called the detective, told him what I'd found, told him to send someone immediately. He said a unit was on the way, told me to wait outside. I should have listened. Instead, I went to the garage and found the stepladder I'd bought for changing light bulbs, carried it upstairs, and positioned it beneath that panel. Duke was frantic now, barking, whining, pawing at my legs. He didn't want me going up there. He knew something I didn't. I pushed the panel aside. The smell hit me first. Stale air, dust, something else underneath, something organic and wrong. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and pointed it into the darkness above my head. The attic was small, just a crawl space, really, with exposed insulation and wooden beams. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw a sleeping bag, a pillow, empty water bottles and food wrappers scattered around, a battery-powered lantern, a stack of magazines, and photographs, more photographs, pinned to the beams like some kind of shrine. Dozens of them, all of me, sleeping, eating, walking Duke in the backyard. Some of them were taken from angles that didn't match Carl's, different windows, different perspectives. Someone else had been living in my attic. I dropped the flashlight, scrambled down the ladder so fast I nearly fell. Duke was barking uncontrollably now, and I could hear sirens in the distance, and all I could think was, how long? How long was someone up there? How many nights did they watch me through a gap in the ceiling while I slept 10 feet below? The police found more evidence in the attic than they'd found in Carl Richter's apartment. A journal, different handwriting, detailed entries going back almost a year, before I'd even moved in. Whoever had been living up there had watched the previous owners too, had watched the house sit empty on the market, had watched me move in and make it my home, all while they nested in the space above my head. His name was Dennis Proctor, 51 years old, homeless, with a history of mental illness and minor criminal charges. He'd found the attic access years ago when the house belonged to someone else and had been coming and going ever since, using it as shelter when he needed somewhere to sleep, watching the people below like they were characters in a show put on for his entertainment. He and Carl Richter didn't know each other. That was the worst part. Two separate predators drawn to the same house, watching the same woman, completely unaware of each other's existence. Carl had been climbing through my window while Dennis had been descending from my ceiling, and somehow, impossibly, they'd never crossed paths. The police found Dennis 3 days later, sleeping in an abandoned building on the other side of town. He didn't resist arrest, didn't seem to understand why what he'd done was wrong. He kept asking about me, asking if I was okay, like he genuinely cared, like we had some kind of relationship. The photographs in his attic were worse than Carl's, more intimate, more invasive. He'd cut a small hole in the ceiling above my bed, covered it with a piece of dark fabric, and used it to watch me sleep. Some of his journal entries were almost tender. He wrote about how beautiful I looked, how peaceful, how he wished he could protect me from the world. 23 times in my bedroom, Carl Richter had written. Dennis Proctor had been up there almost every night for 7 months. Duke had tried to tell me. Every bark, every growl, every time he refused to walk down that hallway. He was warning me that something was above us, something in the ceiling, something watching. I should have listened. I sold the house 3 months later. Couldn't step foot in it after what they found in the attic. Couldn't even drive down Brenner Street without feeling like the walls were closing in. My realtor said I'd take a loss selling so soon, especially once the news got out about what had happened there. I didn't care. I would have paid someone to take it off my hands just to never think about it again. Both trials happened within 6 months of each other. Carl Richter went first, guilty on multiple counts of stalking, breaking and entering, and invasion of privacy. His lawyer tried to argue that he'd never touched me, never threatened me, that watching wasn't the same as hurting. The jury disagreed. They gave him 12 years, and the judge made sure he'd have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. Dennis Proctor's trial was more complicated. His public defender pushed hard for an insanity plea, arguing that his mental illness made him incapable of understanding that what he'd done was wrong. The psychiatrists who evaluated him were split. Some said he knew exactly what he was doing. Others said his delusions had convinced him that watching over me was an act of protection, not predation. In the end, the jury found him guilty but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 15 years in a psychiatric facility, with the possibility of transfer to a regular prison if his condition improved. I testified at both trials, sat in witness boxes, and described the footprint in the spare room, the tally marks behind my bed, the photographs pinned to the attic beams. I looked at Carl Richter's empty eyes and Dennis Proctor's confused, almost hurt expression, and I tried to understand how two men could fixate on the same woman without ever knowing about each other. The prosecutor called it a statistical anomaly, a perfect storm of vulnerability and opportunity. The house's location, its layout, its multiple access points. It had attracted predators the way a wound attracts infection. I'd just been unlucky enough to move into it. I don't believe in luck anymore, good or bad. I believe in paying attention, in trusting the warnings you're given, in listening to the alarms that go off even when you can't see the danger. Duke knew. From the very first day, Duke knew that something was wrong with that house. He'd felt it in the air, sensed it in ways that my human brain couldn't process. Every bark, every growl, every refusal to walk down that hallway, he was screaming at me to pay attention. And I dismissed him, medicated him, told myself he was just anxious, just adjusting, just being a difficult dog. He wasn't being difficult. He was trying to save my life. And when I finally listened, when I finally took his warning seriously, it was almost too late. I live in a different city now. A second-floor apartment with no attic access, no trellis outside the windows, no crawl spaces where someone could hide. Duke sleeps in my bedroom every night, right next to my bed, and I've learned to trust him completely. When he barks at nothing, I check. When he refuses to go somewhere, I don't force him. When his hackles rise for no apparent reason, I take it seriously. He's never steered me wrong. That night in the house on Brenner Street, when he stood at the bottom of the stairs growling at the ceiling, he was telling me exactly where the danger was. I just didn't understand the language. I think about the other women sometimes. The previous owners of that house, the ones Dennis Proctor watched before me, they never knew. Lived their lives, went about their routines, slept peacefully in a bedroom with a hole in the ceiling, and they never had any idea someone was up there. Maybe they didn't have a dog. Maybe they did, and they ignored it the way I almost did. I think about all the houses with attics and crawl spaces and gaps in the walls, all the places where someone could hide, could watch, could exist inches away from families who have no idea they're not alone. It's impossible to check everything, impossible to be vigilant every second of every day. But you can listen. You can pay attention to the warnings. The ones from your gut, the ones from the people around you, the ones from your animals who sense things you never will. Duke is 9 years old now, getting gray around the muzzle, a little slower on our walks than he used to be. The vet says he's healthy for his age, should have several more good years in him. I hope so. I don't know what I'll do when he's gone. He's not just a pet to me anymore. He's the reason I'm still here. If you have a dog and they bark at something you can't see, don't dismiss it. Don't assume they're being anxious or difficult or weird. Get up. Turn on the lights. Check the corners and the closets and the spaces above your head. Animals know things we don't. They hear frequencies we can't hear, smell scents we can't smell, sense presences that are invisible to our limited human perception. When they try to tell you something is wrong, believe them. I didn't believe Duke for months. I took him to the vet, gave him supplements, tried to train away his warnings like they were behavioral problems to be solved. And the whole time, 2 different men were invading my home, watching me sleep, documenting my life in photographs and journals while I lay unconscious beneath them. 23 times through the window, 7 months in the attic. And my dog knew. My dog knew the whole time. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. Trust your animals. Trust the warnings you can't explain. Trust the feeling in your gut that says something is wrong, even when everything looks fine. Because the house on Brenner Street looked fine. The hallway looked empty. The ceiling looked solid and safe and unremarkable. But Duke knew better. And if I'd listened to him sooner, I might have saved myself months of terror and years of nightmares. He's lying at my feet right now as I tell you this. Still watching, still listening, still keeping guard. And if he starts barking at nothing tonight, I'm going to get up and check. Every single time. Story 2. Someone tried logging into my bank account from my city. The notification came at 2:34 in the afternoon, while I was sitting in a meeting pretending to care about quarterly projections. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I glanced at it under the table the way you do when you're bored and looking for any excuse to check out mentally. What I saw made my stomach drop. Unusual login attempt detected on your account. Location: Portland, Oregon. If this wasn't you, please secure your account immediately. Portland, Oregon, my city. Not some server farm in Eastern Europe. Not a VPN routing through Singapore. Not any of the usual suspects you expect when you get these alerts. Someone in my city, maybe in my neighborhood, maybe down the street, had just tried to access my bank account. I excused myself from the meeting, mumbled something about a family emergency, and found an empty conference room where I could deal with this. Changed my password, enabled 2-factor authentication, checked my recent transactions. Nothing seemed to be missing. No unauthorized charges, no transfers I didn't recognize. Whoever had tried to get in hadn't succeeded. I told myself it was probably nothing, a coincidence. Maybe I'd clicked on a phishing link without realizing it. Or maybe my information had been part of some data breach and was floating around on the dark web. These things happened all the time. The important thing was that they hadn't gotten in, and now my account was more secure than ever. I went back to my meeting, finished my workday, drove home to my apartment. By evening, I'd almost forgotten about it. Then the second alert came. This one was at 11:47 p.m., just as I was getting ready for bed. Same message, same location. Portland, OR. Someone had tried again, and this time they'd gotten the password right. It was only the two-factor authentication that stopped them. I stared at my phone, suddenly very awake, and watched the screen like I expected it to show me who was on the other end. They had my new password, the one I'd created just hours ago, the one I hadn't used anywhere else, hadn't written down, hadn't shared with anyone. How? I spent the next hour going through my digital life with a fine-tooth comb, changed every password I could think of, email, social media, streaming services, everything. Ran antivirus scans on my laptop and my phone, checked for suspicious apps, unfamiliar programs, anything that might indicate I'd been compromised. Found nothing. My devices were clean, my accounts showed no signs of unauthorized access, but someone had my new password, someone who was close enough to be in my city, trying to log in from what the bank's security system identified as a residential IP address. Not a data center, not a corporate network, someone's home. I barely slept that night, kept checking my phone, waiting for another alert, another attempt. None came. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overreacting. The password thing was weird, sure, but maybe I'd accidentally used the same one somewhere else. Maybe there was a keylogger on one of my devices that the antivirus hadn't detected. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. I'm 32 years old. I work in marketing for a tech company downtown, which means I spend most of my day staring at screens and pretending to understand analytics. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Not fancy, but safe. I've been single for about a year, since my last relationship ended in that slow, mutual fade that happens when two people realize they're not right for each other, but neither wants to be the one to say it. My life is normal. Boring, even. I go to work. I go to the gym. I meet friends for dinner occasionally. I don't have enemies. I don't have stalkers. I don't have anyone in my life who would have any reason to target me like this. Or so I thought. The third alert came 2 days later. Same pattern. Someone in Portland trying to access my account. But this time, it wasn't my bank. It was my email. And this time, they got in. I found out because I got a notification that my password had been changed. Not by me. By someone who'd managed to get past my two-factor authentication, which should have been impossible. I scrambled to recover the account, went through the whole verification process, and eventually got back in. When I checked the login history, I saw it. An IP address in Portland, logged in for 17 minutes before I'd managed to lock them out. 17 minutes. That's a lot of time to read someone's emails, to go through their sent folder, their drafts, their contacts, to learn things about them that they've never told anyone else. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before. My email was my life. Work communications, personal conversations, receipts and confirmations, and password reset links for every service I used. Whoever had been in there for those 17 minutes now knew things about me that even my closest friends didn't know. My salary, my medical appointments, the late-night messages I'd sent to my ex when I was lonely and second-guessing myself. The police weren't much help. I filed a report, explained what had happened, showed them the login history and the alerts. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but clearly out of his depth. Cybercrime wasn't really their department, he said. He'd forward the information to the right people, but I shouldn't expect much. These cases were hard to solve, especially when nothing had actually been stolen. Nothing stolen. Like my privacy didn't count. Like the 17 minutes someone had spent reading my most personal communications were meaningless because they hadn't taken any money. I went home that night and sat in my dark apartment, staring at the walls, trying to figure out who would do this, who had access to my information, who knew enough about me to guess my security questions, to get past my authentication, to find their way into the most protected parts of my digital life. The answer came to me slowly, reluctantly, like a memory I didn't want to examine too closely. 3 months ago, I'd gone on a couple of dates with a guy I'd met on an app. His name was Kevin. He'd seemed nice enough. Software engineer, good sense of humor, easy to talk to. We'd met for coffee, then dinner, and I'd let him walk me home because it was a nice night and he lived nearby. I'd let him walk me home. He knew where I lived. We'd talked about work, about hobbies, about the little details of our lives that you share when you're trying to get to know someone. I'd mentioned my bank by name, complained about their app. I'd told him my mother's maiden name when he asked about my family history. I'd given him my email address so he could send me a link to some article he'd mentioned. I'd handed him the keys to my entire digital life, and I hadn't even realized it. I found Kevin's profile on the dating app that night. We'd unmatched after things fizzled out, but I remembered his last name from when he'd sent me that article. His email address had included it. Kevin Marsh, software engineer, 34 years old according to his profile. Brown hair, average build, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. I stared at his photos for a long time, trying to reconcile the smiling guy in the pictures with the person who might be systematically breaking into my accounts. He'd seemed so normal, so harmless. We'd laughed about bad first date stories and argued about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He'd been charming in that low-key way that didn't feel like a performance. But he was a software engineer. He would know how to do this. And he had all the information he needed. My bank, my mother's maiden name, my email address, my home address. Everything I'd casually handed over while sipping wine and thinking about whether I wanted a second date. I reported him to the dating app, explaining what had happened. They said they'd investigate. Then I blocked his number, blocked his email, and tried to figure out what to do next. The logical thing would have been to confront him, send a message, demand to know if he was behind this. But something stopped me. If it was him, confronting him would let him know I was onto him. And if it wasn't, if I was wrong, and Kevin was just an awkward date I'd never clicked with, I'd be accusing an innocent person of something terrible. So I did something else instead. I started watching my own life. I checked the login history on every account I could access. Email, social media, streaming services, cloud storage. Anywhere Kevin might have tried to get in. What I found made me sick. My cloud storage had been accessed 3 weeks ago from a Portland IP address. Someone had spent over an hour browsing through my photos, years of memories, vacations, selfies, pictures I'd taken and forgotten about. They'd downloaded a folder called Personal that contained photos I'd never shared with anyone. Nothing explicit, but private. Pictures of me at home in pajamas, pictures from a solo trip I'd taken after my breakup, pictures that were never meant for anyone's eyes but mine. My streaming account showed a second profile I hadn't created. Someone had been watching shows under my subscription, true crime documentaries mostly, along with a thriller series about a stalker who becomes obsessed with a woman after a chance encounter. The viewing history went back 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He'd been inside my digital life for 6 weeks, and I'd had no idea. I went through my emails again, this time looking at what had been read during those 17 minutes. Work stuff mostly, but also personal correspondence, messages from my mom, conversations with friends, a long thread with my ex where I'd poured out my feelings about why things hadn't worked. Kevin had read all of it, had seen me at my most vulnerable, my most honest, my most unguarded. The violation was almost physical. I felt it in my chest, this tight, sick feeling that wouldn't go away. Someone had been watching me for weeks, learning about me, studying me like I was a project, a puzzle to be solved. I called in sick the next day, couldn't face going to work, sitting in meetings, pretending everything was normal when someone out there knew my secrets. Instead, I did research. Typed Kevin's name into every search engine I could think of, looking for anything that might tell me who he really was. His LinkedIn profile was professional and sparse. Software engineer at a company I'd heard of. Previous positions at a couple of startups. No red flags. His Facebook was locked down. Privacy settings tight. Nothing visible except a profile picture that matched his dating app photos. Same with Instagram. He existed online just enough to seem normal. but not enough to reveal anything real. Then I found the Reddit account. It wasn't under his real name. It was a username that combined part of his email address with some numbers. The kind of thing people don't think about when they're trying to stay anonymous. The account had been active for 4 years, mostly in tech and gaming forums. But about 6 months ago, the posts had shifted. He'd started commenting in communities about relationships, about rejection, about women who'd led him on and then disappeared. His language was bitter, resentful, the words of someone who felt the world owed him something it wasn't delivering. In one thread, he'd described a woman who'd gone on 2 dates with him and then stopped responding. He'd called her a typical shallow bitch who didn't deserve his attention. The timeline matched. 6 months ago was when we'd gone out, when I'd decided, after 2 perfectly pleasant but ultimately unexciting dates, that I wasn't feeling it and let things fade. I hadn't ghosted him exactly. I'd responded to his last text with something non-committal, some excuse about being busy with work, but I hadn't suggested another date, hadn't kept the conversation going, had just quietly let things die the way you do when you're not interested. He hadn't taken it quietly. The posts got worse the further I scrolled. He wrote about women who'd rejected him like they were enemies, adversaries who needed to be punished. He never mentioned names, never gave identifying details, but the anger was there on every line, raw and festering and looking for an outlet. In one of his most recent posts, from just a few weeks ago, he'd written, "Some people think they can just ignore you and you'll go away. They don't realize how much information they've already given you, how easy it is to stay connected to someone who thinks they've moved on." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in my apartment with all the lights on, trying not to throw up. He wasn't just accessing my accounts. He wasn't just reading my emails and browsing my photos. He was watching me, staying connected, like he'd said, refusing to let me move on even though I'd never known he was there. And if he knew where I lived, the digital stalking might not be the end of it. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Cars parked on my street that I didn't recognize. People walking behind me on the sidewalk. The feeling sometimes of being watched. That prickle at the back of your neck that could be paranoia or could be instinct trying to tell you something. For a week, nothing happened. No new login attempts. No suspicious activity on my accounts. I'd changed everything, locked everything down, enabled every security feature I could find. Kevin, if it was Kevin, seemed to have backed off. I almost convinced myself it was over, that he'd gotten bored, moved on, found some other woman to obsess over. The alternative was too frightening to think about, so I chose not to think about it. Went back to work, went back to the gym, tried to resume my normal life. Then I saw him. It was a Thursday evening, and I'd stopped at the grocery store on my way home from work. I was in the produce section, squeezing avocados and thinking about nothing in particular, when I looked up and saw a face I recognized. Brown hair, average build, forgettable features. Kevin, standing at the end of the aisle, pretending to look at apples, but his eyes were on me. Our gazes met for half a second. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge me, didn't do anything that would seem threatening to anyone watching. He just looked. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner before I could decide what to do. My hands were shaking as I abandoned my cart and left the store. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the entrance, waiting to see if he'd come out. He didn't. Either he'd left through another exit, or he was still in there, waiting for me to leave so he could follow. I drove home, taking a route I'd never used before, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. No one followed me. When I got to my apartment, I locked every lock and checked every window and sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, trying to decide if what had just happened was worth calling the police about. A man I'd dated was in the same grocery store as me. That's all it was, on paper. People ran into their exes all the time. It didn't mean anything. It didn't prove anything. But he'd been looking at me, Not the casual glance of someone who recognizes a familiar face, a focused, intense stare that had lasted just long enough to make sure I saw him. He wanted me to know he was there. I filed another police report. The same officer from before took my statement, and I could see the skepticism in his eyes. A guy was in the same store as you? That's not exactly a crime. I showed him the Reddit posts, the login attempts, the evidence that Kevin had been accessing my accounts for weeks. He wrote it all down, but didn't seem convinced. Without proof that this specific person is behind the account breaches, there's not much we can do, he said. Have you considered a restraining order? A restraining order? Based on what? 2 dates and a grocery store encounter? I'd need evidence, documentation, a pattern of behavior that a judge would find credible. All I had was circumstantial, Reddit posts that didn't mention my name, login attempts that couldn't be definitively traced to Kevin, and a feeling in my gut that something was very wrong. I hired a cybersecurity consultant the next day. It cost more than I could really afford, but I needed to know for sure. He went through my devices, my accounts, my entire digital footprint, looking for traces of whoever had been getting in. What he found was worse than I'd imagined. There was a keylogger on my laptop, sophisticated, nearly undetectable, installed almost 3 months ago, right around the time of my second date with Kevin, when I'd left my laptop open on my coffee table while I went to the bathroom. He must have done it then, in those 2 or 3 minutes when I wasn't watching. Just walked over, plugged in a USB drive, and installed software that would record every keystroke I made. Every password, every private message, every late-night Google search about whether I was being paranoid, whether I should contact him, whether what I was feeling was real. He'd been reading all of it, in real time, for 3 months. The consultant found more. A tracking app on my phone, disguised as a system utility, reporting my location every 15 minutes. Kevin knew where I was at all times, knew when I was at work, when I was at the gym, when I was home alone in my apartment. The grocery store hadn't been a coincidence. He'd known exactly where I'd be. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. 3 months. He'd been watching me for 3 months, and I'd had no idea. Every moment of privacy I thought I had was an illusion. Every time I'd felt safe in my own home, he'd been there with me. Not physically, but close enough, reading my thoughts before I'd even finished typing them. The consultant helped me clean everything, wiped my devices, installed new security software, changed every password to something randomly generated and impossible to guess. He showed me how to check for tracking apps, how to spot the signs of a compromised system. Then he told me something I didn't want to hear. This level of surveillance, it's not casual. Whoever did this put real effort into it. They wanted to know everything about you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. People who do this, they don't just stop. They escalate. Escalate. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. That night, I lay awake in the dark, thinking about Kevin reading my keystrokes, thinking about him knowing my location, tracking my movements, watching me live my life through the data I generated without even trying. I'd been so focused on the digital invasion that I'd almost missed the obvious question. If he'd been tracking my location for 3 months, he knew my routines better than I did. He knew when I came home, when I left, when I was alone. He knew I was alone right now. I called my friend Megan and asked if I could stay at her place. Didn't explain everything, just said I was dealing with a stalker situation and didn't feel safe at home. She didn't hesitate, told me to come over immediately, that her couch was mine for as long as I needed it. That's the kind of friend Megan is, the kind who doesn't ask questions when you're scared. I packed a bag as fast as I could, clothes, toiletries, my laptop and phone now that they'd been cleaned. I was stuffing everything into a duffel when I heard something that made me freeze. A knock at my door. It was after 11 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood in my bedroom, bag half packed, heart suddenly pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps that echoed through my quiet apartment. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No one there, just the beige carpet and the neighbor's welcome mat and the elevator doors at the end of the corridor. But someone had knocked. I'd heard it. I hadn't imagined it. My phone buzzed in my hand, a text from an unknown number. "I know you're in there." I stopped breathing, stared at the screen, at those 5 words, at the number I didn't recognize but knew instinctively who it belonged to. Another text. "You shouldn't have changed your passwords. That wasn't very nice." And another. "We had something. You felt it too. I know you did." I backed away from the door, thumbs shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered, calm and professional, and I whispered that someone was outside my apartment, that I was being stalked, that I needed help right now. She said units were on the way, told me to stay on the line, asked me to describe what was happening. Another knock, louder this time. Then his voice, muffled through the door, but unmistakably familiar. "I just want to talk. That's all. Just open the door and talk to me." I didn't answer. Pressed myself against the far wall of my living room, as far from the door as I could get, and listened to the operator relay information to dispatch. "I know everything about you," Kevin said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "I've read your emails, your texts, your search history. I know about the fight you had with your mom last month. I know you still think about your ex. I know you cried last Tuesday night because you felt lonely." Every word was a violation, every private moment he'd stolen, thrown back at me through a closed door. I felt tears streaming down my face, but couldn't make a sound. "You don't have to be lonely," he continued. "I've been here the whole time, watching over you, making sure you're okay. Don't you understand? I care about you more than anyone ever has." The doorknob rattled. He was trying to get in. "Ma'am, are you still there?" The 911 operator's voice in my ear. "Officers are 2 minutes out. Stay away from the door." 2 minutes. An eternity. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Long enough that I thought maybe he'd left, maybe he'd heard sirens in the distance and decided to run. Then I heard something else. Footsteps moving away from my door, moving toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. And then the sound of the emergency exit opening, the one that led to the fire escape, the one that connected to the window in my bedroom. I ran, grabbed my bag and my keys and threw open my front door, sprinting down the hallway toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard a window opening. My window, my bedroom. He was climbing in through the fire escape while I was trying to get out. The elevator was too slow. I hit the stairs instead, taking them 2 at a time, nearly falling twice as I spiraled down 4 flights to the lobby. I burst through the door and into the building's entrance just as red and blue lights flooded through the front windows. 2 police cars were pulling up outside. I ran to them, sobbing, trying to explain that he was in my apartment, that he'd climbed through the window, that he was up there right now. The officers moved fast. One stayed with me while the others ran into the building, guns drawn. They found Kevin in my bedroom. He was sitting on my bed when they came through the door, just sitting there, calm and still, like he'd been waiting for them. He didn't resist, didn't try to run. When they put the handcuffs on, he looked at the officers and said, "I wasn't going to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand." They took him away in the back of a cruiser. I watched the car disappear down the street, and I didn't feel relief. I felt hollow, empty, like something had been carved out of me that I'd never get back. The officers took my statement, photographed the window he'd climbed through, the bedroom where he'd been sitting, the texts he'd sent that were still on my phone. They told me I'd done the right thing, that calling 911 had probably saved my life, that Kevin was going to be charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and criminal harassment. "You're lucky," one of them said. "These situations don't always end like this." Lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I'd been living in a fishbowl for 3 months while someone watched my every move, and now the glass had finally shattered and I was lying in the shards. Megan picked me up from the police station at 3 a.m. She didn't ask questions, just wrapped me in a blanket and drove me to her apartment and made up the couch with clean sheets. I lay there in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her building, and tried to convince myself that it was over. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Kevin had said through my door. The things he'd known, the private moments he'd stolen. I've been here the whole time, watching over you. He'd been there for 3 months, tracking my location, reading my keystrokes, following my life like a story written just for him. And I'd had no idea, not until a bank notification popped up on my phone during a boring meeting, telling me that someone in my city was trying to log in. Kevin Marsh pleaded guilty to stalking, breaking and entering, harassment, and unauthorized access to computer systems. His lawyer tried to negotiate a lighter sentence, arguing that Kevin had never physically harmed me, that his mental health issues had contributed to his behavior, that he was genuinely remorseful and willing to seek treatment. The prosecutor pushed back hard. She showed the court his Reddit posts, his journals full of resentment toward women who'd rejected him, the meticulous records he'd kept of my movements and habits. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, she argued. This was a pattern, a predator learning his craft. The judge agreed. 5 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation, a permanent restraining order, mandatory registration as a stalker in any state he moved to. Kevin showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He just looked at me, the same flat, focused stare he'd given me in the grocery store, and then they led him away. I testified at the sentencing hearing, described what it felt like to learn that someone had been reading every word I typed for 3 months, described lying awake at night wondering if he was outside my window, watching the location dot that represented me on his phone, described the moment I heard his voice through my door, listing my private moments like items on a shopping list. The prosecutor asked me if I felt safe now that he was going to prison. I told her the truth. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe again. That was 18 months ago. Kevin is still locked up, will be for at least another 3 years before he's eligible for parole. I get notifications whenever there's a hearing, whenever his status changes, whenever anything happens that might affect his release date. I've set up alerts for his name, monitoring news and public records in case he tries something from inside. People think prison means it's over. It doesn't. It just means the threat is contained for a while. I moved to a new apartment across town. New building, new neighborhood, new routines. I don't use dating apps anymore. Can't bring myself to trust anyone I meet that way. The few dates I've been on since have been with friends of friends, people who've been vouched for. And even then, I find myself analyzing everything they say, looking for red flags, waiting for the mask to slip. I know that's not fair to them. I know most people are exactly who they seem to be, but Kevin seemed normal too, and look where that got me. I check my devices obsessively now, run security scans weekly, sometimes daily. I use a password manager with randomly generated strings of characters that even I can't remember. I cover my laptop camera with tape. I never leave my phone unattended, never let my computer out of my sight in public, never give anyone access to anything without thinking 3 times about what I'm handing over. My therapist says this hypervigilance is a trauma response, that eventually it will fade as I process what happened and rebuild my sense of security. Maybe she's right. Some days are better than others. Some days I almost feel like my old self, the person who went on dates without calculating escape routes and didn't flinch when her phone buzzed with a notification. Other days I still see his face in every crowd, still feel like I'm being watched even when I'm completely alone. The thing that haunts me most isn't what Kevin did. It's how easy it was. A couple of dates, a few casual conversations, 3 minutes alone with my laptop while I went to the bathroom. That's all it took for him to install himself in my life. He didn't need technical expertise or criminal connections, just patience, resentment, and the information I'd willingly handed over because I thought he was a nice guy who might be worth getting to know. We give away so much without thinking about it. Our mother's maiden name, our childhood pet, our first car. All those security questions we answer honestly because we assume they're protecting us. Our daily routines, our workplaces, our home addresses, the banks we use, the apps on our phones, the passwords we type while someone we barely know sits across the room. Kevin learned everything he needed to know about me in 2 evenings. Then he used that information to take over my digital life, track my physical movements, and eventually climb through my bedroom window convinced that he had every right to be there, because in his mind, he knew me. He'd read my emails, my texts, my private searches in the middle of the night. He knew me better than anyone, and that made him entitled to me. That's the logic of a stalker. Intimacy equals ownership. Knowledge equals access. They convince themselves that watching is the same as caring, that obsession is the same as love. If you're reading this, if you've ever been on a date with someone who seemed nice, someone harmless, someone you let walk you home or sit in your living room or borrow your phone charger, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to warn you. Be careful what you share. Lie about your mother's maiden name. Make up a fake first pet. Don't tell anyone where you bank or what email service you use or the name of the street you grew up on. Those details seem insignificant until someone uses them to take apart your life piece by piece. And if you ever get a notification that someone tried to log into your account from your own city, don't dismiss it. Don't assume it's a glitch or a coincidence or some hacker in a distant server farm. Take it seriously. Change your passwords. Check your devices. Pay attention. Because the person trying to get in might not be a stranger at all. They might be someone you met for coffee once, someone who seemed charming and forgettable, someone who's been watching and waiting for months while you had no idea. Kevin is in prison now, but there are other people like him out there. Other dates that seem harmless. Other conversations where you share too much without realizing it. Other 2-minute windows when someone could install something on your laptop and change your life forever. The notification that saved me came at 2:34 in the afternoon during a meeting about quarterly projections. I almost ignored it, almost swiped it away and went back to pretending to pay attention. I'm so glad I didn't. Pay attention to the warnings, even the small ones, especially the small ones. They might be the only thing standing between you and someone who thinks that knowing you means owning you. Story 3. The same car parked next to me every day. Most people don't pay attention to the cars around them. They walk through parking lots with their heads down, keys in hand, focused on getting from point A to point B without thinking about the vehicles they pass. But I've always noticed cars. My dad was a mechanic when I was growing up, and he taught me to identify makes and models before I could read. It was a game we played on road trips. Spot the Mustang, find the vintage Corvette, count how many Priuses we pass. That habit never left me. Even now, in my late 20s, I automatically catalog the cars in any lot I walk through. That's how I noticed the silver Nissan Altima. It was parked next to my car in the office lot on a Monday morning in March. Nothing remarkable about it. A few years old, standard trim, the kind of car that blends into any parking lot anywhere in America. I noticed it the way I noticed everything. A quick mental snapshot, filed away and forgotten. Silver Altima, slight dent in the rear bumper, Washington plates. Then, I went inside and spent 8 hours doing data entry and didn't think about it again. The next morning, it was there again. Same spot, right next to my Honda Civic, which I always parked in the far corner of the lot because I was mildly paranoid about door dings. I'd been parking in that same spot for 2 years, ever since I started at the company. It was my spot in that unspoken way that regular parking spaces become claimed territory. And now this Altima was there, occupying the space beside it like it had every right to be. I remember thinking it was probably a new employee, someone who'd joined recently, who happened to arrive around the same time I did, who'd chosen that corner of the lot for the same door ding avoidance reasons I had. A reasonable explanation. The kind of coincidence that happens in shared spaces all the time. By Friday, the Altima had been next to my car every single day that week. I'd started paying closer attention, looking for any sign of who drove it, but I never saw anyone get in or out. It was just always there when I arrived, and still there when I left, like it existed only in relation to my car, appearing and disappearing according to some schedule I couldn't see. I asked around the office, described the car, the plates, asked if anyone knew who'd started driving a silver Altima. Nobody did. Our company wasn't that big, maybe 60 employees, and everyone knew everyone else's car. The Altima didn't belong to any of them. That should have been my first real warning sign. A car that showed up in our lot every day but didn't belong to anyone who worked there. But I rationalized it away. Maybe it was someone from the business next door. Maybe it was a visitor who came regularly. Maybe the owner walked to a different building and I just never saw them. The next week, I started varying my arrival time. Got there early one day, late another. Parked in a different spot entirely on Wednesday just to see what would happen. Every single time, within an hour of my arrival, the silver Altima would appear. Not always in the spot right next to me, sometimes one space over, sometimes across the aisle, but always close, always facing my car, always empty. I took a picture of it, then another, documenting the license plate clearly. I didn't know what I was going to do with the photos, but something in my gut told me I might need them. That instinct you develop when you've spent too much time reading true crime articles and watching Dateline specials. That little voice that says document everything, just in case. 2 weeks into this, I saw the Altima somewhere else. I'd stopped at a grocery store after work, one I didn't usually go to because it was in the opposite direction from my apartment. I was picking up a few things for dinner, distracted, not thinking about cars or parking lots or the silver Nissan that had taken up residence in my brain. I came out of the store with my bags, walked to my car, and there it was. Parked 3 spaces away. Same dent in the rear bumper. Same Washington plates. I stood there in the middle of the lot, grocery bags hanging from my hands, staring at that car like it might transform into something else if I looked long enough. It couldn't be a coincidence. This wasn't near my office, wasn't anywhere near my usual routes. There was no logical reason for this specific car to be at this specific store at the exact same time I happened to stop here. Unless it had followed me. I got in my car and locked the doors immediately. Sat there for 10 minutes watching the Altima, waiting for someone to approach it. No one did. Eventually I drove home, checking my rear-view mirror every few seconds, looking for silver cars in the traffic behind me. I didn't see the Altima, but that didn't mean anything. Whoever was driving it clearly knew how to keep their distance. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through possibilities in my head, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was someone who lived in my area, worked near my office, and shopped at the same stores. Cities were like that sometimes. You crossed paths with the same strangers over and over without ever realizing it. Maybe I was just noticing now because I'd started paying attention, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had it backwards. I wasn't noticing the car because I'd started paying attention. Someone had started paying attention to me, and the silver Altima was how they were doing it. The next morning, I drove to work using a completely different route. Took side streets, made unnecessary turns, doubled back twice. I felt ridiculous, paranoid, probably crazy, definitely overreacting. When I finally pulled into the office lot, I scanned every row for the Altima. It wasn't there. For the first time in weeks, my corner of the lot was empty, except for my Civic. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. See? Nothing, just coincidence, just my imagination running wild. I grabbed my bag and headed inside, already composing the text I'd send to my friend, laughing about how paranoid I'd been. When I came back to my car at 5:30, the silver Altima was parked right next to it, and there was a single red rose tucked under my windshield wiper. I didn't touch the rose. I stood there staring at it, my keys digging into my palm, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. A rose. Someone had left me a rose. Someone who'd been following me for weeks, tracking my movements, showing up wherever I went. And now they wanted me to know. The Altima was empty. I walked around it slowly, looking through the windows, searching for any clue about who owned it. Fast food wrappers on the passenger seat, a phone charger plugged into the console, a baseball cap on the dashboard. Nothing that told me anything useful, just the detritus of someone's daily life, as ordinary and unremarkable as the car itself. I took photos of everything, the rose on my windshield, the Altima's plates, the interior through the windows. Then I grabbed the rose with my sleeve, not wanting to touch it directly, not wanting my fingerprints on something that might become evidence, and threw it in the trash can by the building entrance. My hands were shaking the entire time. The police were sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. I drove straight to the station after leaving work, showed them my photos, explained the pattern I'd been tracking. The officer who took my report wrote everything down, but kept asking questions that made me feel like I was the one being investigated. Are you sure it's the same car? Could it belong to someone you know? Is there anyone who might be playing a prank on you? I didn't know. That was the problem. I didn't know who was doing this, or why, and without that information, there wasn't much the police could do. They said they'd run the plates, look into the registered owner, but they couldn't promise anything. Parking near someone isn't a crime, they reminded me. Neither is leaving a flower on someone's car. The plates came back, registered to a rental company. A dead end. Whoever was driving the Altima had rented it, which meant the trail stopped there unless the police could get the rental company to release their records. That required a warrant, and a warrant required evidence of an actual crime. So far, all I had was a persistent car and a single rose. I started taking different routes everywhere. To work, to the grocery store, to the gym. I'd leave my apartment at random times, take circuitous paths, double back and watch for anyone following me. Some days I didn't see the Altima at all. Other days it would appear in my rearview mirror, keeping a steady distance, never close enough to feel like an immediate threat, but always there. A reminder that I was being watched. The roses kept coming, one every few days, always on my car, always when I wasn't looking. Red ones, pink ones, white ones. Once there was a note attached. You're beautiful when you're scared. I photographed that one too, added it to the folder on my phone that was growing thicker by the day. Evidence I couldn't use. Proof that meant nothing to anyone but me. My friends thought I was losing it. I tried explaining what was happening, showed them the photos, described the feeling of being hunted. Some of them believed me, got that wide-eyed look of horror, and told me to be careful. Others were skeptical. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the roses were from a secret admirer who didn't realize he was being creepy. Maybe I was reading too much into nothing. I stopped talking about it after a while. The skepticism hurt more than the fear. 3 weeks after the first rose, I finally saw him. I was leaving the gym on a Saturday afternoon, walking across the parking lot with my gym bag over my shoulder, when I noticed the Altima parked in the row behind my car. I stopped, pretended to check my phone, and in my peripheral vision, I saw movement, someone in the driver's seat, shifting, turning to look at me. I looked up, met his eyes through the windshield. He was maybe 40, with a thin face and dark hair going gray at the temples. He had a beard, neatly trimmed, and he was wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. He wasn't handsome, wasn't ugly, wasn't anything that would make him stand out in a crowd. Just a man in a car, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I expected him to look away when our eyes met, to pretend he hadn't been staring, to break the connection and give us both an out. He didn't. He just kept looking at me, his expression calm and focused, like I was something he'd been studying for a long time, and he was finally getting to see up close. I broke first, walked to my car as fast as I could without running, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. I heard an engine start behind me, the Altima pulling out of its spot, heading for the exit. By the time I got my car started and looked up, he was gone. But now I had a face. Now I knew what he looked like. That night, I went through every corner of my memory trying to place him. An ex-boyfriend's friend, a co-worker from a previous job, someone I'd met at a party, a bar, a coffee shop, anyone who might have fixated on me for any reason. I came up empty. I didn't know him, had never seen him before in my life, which meant he'd chosen me for some other reason. Seen me somewhere, decided I was interesting, and started following me without any connection between us at all. That was almost worse than the alternative. At least if I knew him, I might understand what he wanted. This was just random, arbitrary. A stranger who'd decided I belonged to him for no reason I would ever understand. I filed another police report, described the man, his approximate age, the beard, the dark jacket. The officer added it to my file and told me they'd keep looking into it. I could tell from his voice that nothing was going to change. Without a name, without a clear threat, without evidence of a crime more serious than being creepy in a parking lot, the police couldn't help me. I was on my own. I bought pepper spray the next day. Then a personal alarm, one of those keychains that emits an ear-splitting shriek when you pull the pin. I started parking in different spots every day, arriving at random times, leaving through different exits. I varied my routes so much that I sometimes got lost in my own city, taking turns I'd never taken before, just to make sure no one was behind me. For a few days, it seemed to work. No Altima in my rear view, no roses on my windshield. I almost let myself believe that he'd gotten bored, moved on, found some other woman to fixate on. Maybe seeing me see him had broken the spell. Maybe knowing I was aware of him had taken away whatever thrill he got from watching. Then he showed up at my apartment. I lived in a small complex on the east side of the city. 2 stories, maybe 20 units. The kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves and nobody knows their neighbors' names. I'd chosen it specifically because it had a gated parking lot, accessible only with a key fob. An extra layer of security between me and the world. That security meant nothing. I came home from work on a Wednesday evening and found the silver Altima parked in the visitor lot outside the gate. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. The car was right there, facing the entrance to my building, positioned perfectly to watch anyone coming or going. And sitting in the driver's seat, window rolled down despite the chill in the air, was the man from the gym parking lot. He smiled when he saw me. A small smile, almost shy, like we were old friends who'd run into each other unexpectedly. He raised one hand in a little wave. I didn't wave back. I drove through the gate as fast as I could, parked in my assigned spot, and ran to my apartment without looking back. Locked the door, checked the windows, pulled all the blinds closed. Then I stood in my dark living room and tried to control my breathing while my whole body shook. He knew where I lived. All those weeks of varying my routes, all those careful precautions. None of it mattered. He'd found my home, and now he was sitting outside it, watching and waiting. I called the police again. They sent an officer out who talked to the man in the Altima while I watched from my window. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw the man gesture calmly, saw him show the officer something, ID, probably, or the rental agreement for the car. The officer nodded, walked back to his cruiser, and left. The Altima stayed exactly where it was. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. The officer, calling to give me an update. The man's name was Victor Hale, 43 years old, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. He'd told the officer he was waiting for a friend who lived in the complex. When asked why he was there so often, he said he visited frequently. There was nothing illegal about sitting in a public parking lot. Nothing the police could do. Victor Hale. I finally had a name. I spent that night searching for everything I could find about him. Social media profiles, public records, news articles, anything that might tell me who this man was and why he'd chosen me. What I found made my blood run cold. Victor Hale had been accused of stalking before. 3 years ago, a woman in another state had filed a restraining order against him. The court records were sparse, just enough to tell me that he'd followed her, harassed her, made her life a living hell until she finally got the legal system involved. The restraining order had been granted, and as far as I could tell, he'd complied with it. Moved away, started over with me. I dug deeper, found an article from a local newspaper in the woman's hometown. She'd given an interview after the restraining order was granted, warning other women about Victor, describing what he'd done to her. The details were eerily familiar. He'd started by following her car, then leaving gifts, flowers, chocolates, notes telling her how special she was. Then showing up at her home, her work, her gym, always watching, always present, never crossing the line into overt threats, but making it clear that he could reach her whenever he wanted. The woman in the article said the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the gaslighting. Victor had been so careful, so subtle, that everyone around her thought she was overreacting. Her friends, her family, even the police, they all told her it wasn't that serious, that she should be flattered, that if he'd wanted to hurt her, he would have done it by now. She'd felt crazy for years before she finally got someone to take her seriously. I recognized that feeling. I'd been living it for weeks. The article mentioned that Victor had moved after the restraining order. It didn't say where. Now I knew. He'd come here, to my city, and somehow, for some reason, he'd found me. I printed everything I could find, the court records, the newspaper article, the details of his previous victim's experience. I put together a folder of evidence, my photos, my notes, the documentation I'd been keeping since the first time I noticed the Altima in my office parking lot. Then I went back to the police station and demanded to speak with a detective. This time, they listened. The detective who took my case was a woman named Rodriguez, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked through my folder, asked pointed questions, and didn't once suggest that I might be overreacting. When I told her about Victor's previous stalking case, she nodded like she'd expected it. "Stalkers don't stop," she said. "They just find new targets." She couldn't arrest Victor. He still hadn't committed a crime in our jurisdiction, but she could help me get a restraining order. More importantly, she could make sure his name was flagged in their system, so that if he did anything at all, they'd be ready to move. It wasn't enough, but it was something. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my apartment complex. Cars coming and going, doors opening and closing, the ordinary noises of people living their ordinary lives, unaware that a predator was sitting in the parking lot outside watching and waiting. I checked my phone obsessively, waiting for the restraining order paperwork to come through, waiting for something to change. Around midnight, I heard a car engine start outside my window. Then headlights swept across my ceiling as someone pulled out of the lot. I went to the window and looked out through a gap in the blinds. The visitor lot was empty. The Altima was gone. But on the windshield of my car, just visible in the glow of the security lights, was a single red rose. He'd gotten inside the gate. I didn't sleep that night. Sat on my couch with all the lights on, pepper spray in one hand, phone in the other, watching the door like I expected it to burst open at any moment. The gated parking lot was supposed to be secure, key fob access only, but Victor had gotten in anyway, followed another resident through, probably, or figured out a gap in the fence. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that my last layer of protection had failed. Detective Rodriguez called me first thing in the morning. The restraining order had been expedited, she said. Given Victor's history, the judge had taken it seriously. He was legally required to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, my workplace, and my vehicle. If he violated it, they could arrest him. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt the way you feel when someone hands you an umbrella in a hurricane. Better than nothing, but not nearly enough. Restraining orders don't stop bullets, my dad had told me once when I was a teenager reading about a domestic violence case in the news. They're just paper. The only thing that stops a determined person is consequences. Victor Hale had already proven he was determined. He'd stalked one woman until she got a restraining order, then moved across the country and started again with me. A piece of paper wasn't going to change who he was. Still, I had to try. The first few days after the restraining order was served, Victor disappeared. No Altima in my rearview mirror. No roses on my car. No glimpses of his thin face and neatly trimmed beard in parking lots or grocery stores. Detective Rodriguez said that was normal. Sometimes the order itself was enough to scare them off, at least temporarily. Sometimes they complied forever. Sometimes they waited and came back worse. I wanted to believe I'd gotten lucky, that Victor had seen the legal documents and decided I wasn't worth the trouble, that he'd pack up and move again, find some other city, some other woman to fixate on. It was a horrible thought, wishing my nightmare onto a stranger, but I was desperate enough to hope for it anyway. 2 weeks passed, then 3. I started to breathe again, started parking in the same spot at work, taking the same routes home, living something that almost resembled my old life. The hypervigilance faded into a low background hum, always there, but no longer consuming every waking moment. Then I saw the Altima again, not parked near me this time, driving, passing me on the highway during my morning commute, close enough that I could see Victor's profile through the window. He didn't look at me, kept his eyes straight ahead, hands on the wheel. Nothing about his behavior that would suggest he even knew I was there. But I knew, and I knew he knew I knew. He was within 500 feet of me. He was violating the restraining order. I called Detective Rodriguez from my car, voice shaking as I described what had happened. She told me to document everything: time, location, direction of travel. If it happened again, they could use it to build a case. One sighting might not be enough, especially if his lawyer argued it was coincidental, but a pattern would be harder to dismiss. A pattern. I almost laughed. I'd been documenting a pattern for months. The police had files full of my photographs, my notes, my careful records of every time Victor had appeared in my life. How much more of a pattern did they need? The answer, apparently, was more than I had. Over the next week, I saw the Altima 4 more times, always at a distance, always in places that could be explained away as coincidence. The highway, a busy intersection, the parking lot of a shopping center I'd never visited before. Victor was smart. He knew exactly how close he could get without giving the police enough to act on. He was playing a game with rules I didn't understand, and he was winning. The 6th time I saw him, he wasn't in his car. I was walking to my apartment after work, cutting through the breezeway between the parking lot and my building. It was early evening, still light out, other residents coming and going around me. I should have been safe. I should have been surrounded by witnesses. Victor stepped out from behind a pillar about 20 feet ahead of me. I froze. He was just standing there, hands in the pockets of his dark jacket, that same calm expression on his face. He wasn't blocking my path. I could have walked around him, could have turned and gone back the way I came. But my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, pinned in place by those patient, watching eyes. "I just want to talk," he said. His voice was softer than I expected, almost gentle. "That's all. I've been trying to get your attention for months, and you keep running away. You're violating the restraining order." My voice came out thin and reedy, nothing like the firm tone I'd practiced in my head. "You need to leave. The restraining order is a misunderstanding. If you'd just let me explain. Leave, now." He took a step toward me. Just one, but it was enough to break my paralysis. I stumbled backward, pulling the personal alarm from my bag, yanking the pin. The shriek that erupted was deafening, a high-pitched wail that echoed off the buildings and made Victor flinch. People turned, doors opened. A man from my building came running, phone already in hand, asking if I was okay. Victor looked at the gathering crowd, at the phones being raised to record, at the witnesses materializing from every direction. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Not a threat, just a statement, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who believed it completely. Then he walked away, unhurried, casual, like he was just another resident heading to his car. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. But we had him on video now. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses, clear footage of him approaching me, speaking to me, violating the restraining order in ways even his lawyer couldn't explain away. Detective Rodriguez called me that night with the news. Victor Hale had been arrested at his apartment, charged with violation of a protective order and criminal harassment. He was being held without bail, pending a hearing. I sat on my couch and listened to her words and waited to feel safe. The feeling didn't come. Victor Hale's trial happened 4 months later. He was charged with stalking, violation of a protective order, and criminal harassment, multiple counts of each, stretching back to the first documented sighting of the Altima in my office parking lot. His lawyer tried to argue that Victor was mentally ill, that he genuinely believed we had a relationship, that he needed treatment rather than incarceration. The prosecutor showed the jury Victor's history, the previous victim, the restraining order he'd already violated once before, the pattern of behavior that stretched back years. I testified for almost 2 hours, described everything from the beginning. The car appearing next to mine, the roses, the notes, the way he'd smiled and waved at me from the visitor lot like we were old friends. I described the feeling of being hunted, of never knowing when he'd appear, of watching my own rearview mirror more than the road ahead. I described the confrontation in the breezeway, his soft voice telling me he just wanted to talk, the way he'd said, "This isn't over," before walking away. Victor watched me the entire time I testified, that same patient, focused stare he'd given me in the gym parking lot, through the windshield of his rental car, in the breezeway outside my apartment. Even sitting at the defendant's table in handcuffs, he looked at me like I was something that belonged to him, something he was just waiting to reclaim. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge gave him 8 years. Not as long as I'd hoped, but longer than I'd feared. With good behavior, he could be out in 5, maybe less. The math lived in my head constantly, counting down the days until he'd be free again, calculating how old I'd be, wondering if he'd remember me, wondering if I'd have enough warning to run. His previous victim reached out to me after the verdict. She'd seen the news coverage, recognized Victor's name, tracked me down through the detective who'd handled her case. We talked for almost 2 hours on the phone, 2 strangers bonded by the worst experience of our lives. She told me what it had been like for her, the years of looking over her shoulder, the relationships she couldn't maintain because she couldn't trust anyone, the way she still checked the cars around her every time she walked through a parking lot. "It gets better," she said. "Not all the way better, but better." I wanted to believe her. Some days I did. I moved 6 months after the trial. New city, new job, new apartment, in a building with security cameras and a doorman and no visitor parking anywhere near the entrance. I didn't tell anyone from my old life where I was going, just packed up and disappeared, the way Victor had done after his first victim. I became a ghost, erasing myself from the places he knew, hoping that distance would be enough to keep me safe. My dad helped me move. He didn't say much, just loaded boxes into the truck and drove alongside me for the 12-hour trip to my new home. When we finally got there and started unpacking, he put his hand on my shoulder and looked at me with those tired mechanic's eyes. "You did everything right," he said. "You noticed. You documented. You fought back. Not everyone does that. Not everyone can." I knew he was trying to make me feel better, and in a way, it worked. Not because I felt safe, but because I felt seen. I'd spent months feeling crazy, paranoid, dismissed by everyone who thought I was overreacting. My dad never thought that. He'd believed me from the beginning. It's been 2 years now. Victor is still in prison, still has at least 3 more years before he's eligible for parole. I get notifications whenever there's a hearing, whenever anything changes in his case. I've set up alerts for his name, his known aliases, any news that might indicate he's trying to reach me from inside. Some people would call that obsessive. I call it survival. I still notice cars, still catalog makes and models automatically, the way my dad taught me when I was a kid. But now I notice patterns too. The vehicle that shows up in my rearview mirror more than once. The car that's parked near mine too many times to be coincidence. The feeling, subtle but unmistakable, of being watched. I notice everything now. I can't afford not to. Here's what I want you to take from this story. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it probably is. When a car shows up near you too often, when you see the same face in too many places, when you get that prickle at the back of your neck that says someone is paying too much attention. Don't dismiss it. Don't let anyone tell you you're being paranoid. Document everything. Tell someone. Take it seriously before it escalates. I was lucky. I noticed the Altima early when Victor was still just watching. If I'd been less observant, less cautious, less willing to trust my gut even when everyone around me said I was overreacting, I might not be here to tell this story. The previous victim told me that Victor had gotten physical with her before she finally got the restraining order. I don't know what would have happened if I'd given him more time, more access, more opportunities to escalate. I don't want to know. The silver Nissan Altima is probably long gone now, returned to the rental company, rented by other people, driving around with no idea of the history it carries. But sometimes, when I'm walking through a parking lot and I see a silver car out of the corner of my eye, my heart still stutters. I still feel that cold flash of recognition, that instinctive urge to run. Victor Hale took a lot from me. My sense of safety, my ability to trust strangers, my belief that the world is basically good and that bad things only happen to other people. I'll spend the rest of my life rebuilding those things, piece by piece, and I'll never get back to who I was before. But I'm still here, still living my life, still moving forward, still refusing to let him win. If you ever notice a car that shows up too often, a face that appears in too many places, a pattern that feels wrong even if you can't explain why, pay attention, document it. Tell someone who will believe you. And remember, the people who notice things are the ones who survive. My dad taught me to notice cars. That habit saved my life. I don't know what will save yours, but I hope you never have to find out. Story 4. The nurse calling a name. No one else heard. The first time I heard her, I thought I was dreaming. That hazy space between sleep and waking, when your brain conjures sounds and images that feel real until you open your eyes and they dissolve. A woman's voice, soft but clear, calling out a name I didn't recognize. Eleanor. Just that. Just the name, spoken with a kind of gentle patience, like a mother calling a child in for dinner. I opened my eyes to the dim ceiling of my hospital room, the beep of monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and the voice was gone. I told myself I'd imagined it and drifted back to sleep. I was 34 when this happened, recovering from surgery at St. Catherine's Medical Center. Nothing dramatic. Gallbladder removal, a routine procedure they do hundreds of times a year. I'd gone in on a Tuesday morning, been out of the OR by noon, and was expected to go home the next day after a night of observation. Standard stuff. The kind of hospital stay where the biggest concern is whether you'll be bored out of your mind watching daytime television. St. Catherine's was an old hospital, built in the 1930s and renovated piece by piece over the decades. My room was on the 4th floor, in a wing that still had the original hardwood floors and tall windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The nurses called it the Heritage Wing, though they said it with the kind of eye roll that suggested the Heritage was mostly just outdated wiring and unreliable heating. I didn't mind. There was something almost charming about the old bones of the place, the way the building creaked and settled like a living thing. The second time I heard the voice was around 3 a.m., according to the clock on my bedside table. I'd woken up because my IV was pinching, that uncomfortable pressure that means the needle has shifted slightly and needs adjusting. I was reaching for the call button when I heard it again. Eleanor. Clearer this time. Definitely real. Definitely coming from somewhere outside my room. A woman's voice, measured and calm, the kind of professional tone nurses use when they're trying not to alarm anyone. I pressed the call button and waited. A minute later, a nurse appeared. A young guy named Marcus, who'd been checking on me throughout the night. I asked him about the voice, about who Eleanor was. He looked confused. "There's no Eleanor on this floor," he said. "Not right now, anyway. Are you sure you heard someone calling?" I wasn't sure of anything. The painkillers they'd given me made everything feel slightly unreal, like I was watching my own life through a pane of frosted glass. I told Marcus it was probably nothing, probably just a dream that had blurred into waking. He adjusted my IV, told me to get some rest, and left. But I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, the soft footsteps in the hallway, the distant murmur of voices at the nurses' station, the occasional muffled announcement over the PA system. And underneath all of it, just at the edge of hearing, something that might have been a voice, or might have been nothing at all. In the morning, I felt ridiculous. The daylight streaming through those tall windows made everything from the night before seem absurd. I'd been drugged, half asleep, alone in an unfamiliar place. Of course, my brain had conjured phantom voices. That's what brains do when they're stressed and medicated and trying to process too many new stimuli at once. The doctor came by around 9 a.m., checked my incision, said everything looked good. I could go home that afternoon if my vitals stayed stable. I was relieved, ready to get out of there, sleep in my own bed, forget about phantom nurses calling phantom names. Then the woman in the room next to mine died. I didn't see it happen. I just heard the commotion, the rapid footsteps, the urgent voices, the rhythmic thumping of CPR that went on for what felt like forever before someone called time of death. The nurses moved efficiently, professionally, doing whatever it is they do when a patient doesn't make it. I lay in my bed and tried not to listen, tried to give whoever it was some privacy in their final moments. About an hour later, Marcus came to check on me. He looked tired, the way healthcare workers look when they've just lost someone. I asked if he was okay. Part of the job, he said, but his voice was flat. Mrs. Patterson. She'd been declining for a while. It wasn't unexpected. Mrs. Patterson. I nodded, not sure what to say. I hadn't known her, had never even seen her face, just the brief glimpses through her doorway when I walked past on my slow laps around the floor. An elderly woman, white-haired, surrounded by machines. What was her first name? I asked. I don't know why. Just something to say, maybe. Something to make her more than a name on a chart. Marcus paused. Eleanor, he said. Eleanor Patterson. The room tilted. I gripped the bed rail, suddenly dizzy, suddenly cold. Eleanor? Yeah. She'd been here about 2 weeks. Why? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared at him while the pieces clicked together in my head. The voice in the night, the name I didn't recognize, the gentle patience of someone calling a child in from play. The voice had called for Eleanor hours before she died. Called her name in the darkness, soft and clear, like a summons. And I was the only one who'd heard it. I didn't go home that afternoon. Told the doctor I was feeling dizzy, that my pain hadn't subsided enough, that I wanted to stay one more night just to be safe. He agreed without much pushback. Better to be cautious with post-surgical patients, he said. They'd discharge me in the morning. The truth was, I needed to understand what had happened, needed to know if I'd really heard what I thought I'd heard, or if the drugs and the stress and the strange old building had conspired to make me hallucinate. One more night would give me answers, or at least that's what I told myself. I spent the rest of the day paying attention, walking the halls during my prescribed exercise laps, listening to the nurses, watching for anything that might explain a voice calling patients' names in the middle of the night. I asked Marcus about the Heritage Wing, whether there were any stories about it, any history I should know. He laughed and said the only thing historic about the 4th floor was the plumbing. But one of the older nurses, a woman named Gladys, who looked like she'd been working at St. Catherine's since the building was new, gave me a different answer. She was changing my bandages when I asked, her weathered hands gentle and practiced. People hear things in old hospitals, she said, especially this floor. It used to be the maternity ward, way back when. Then it was long-term care for a while. Now it's general surgical recovery. She paused, checking the edges of my incision. A lot of people have passed through here. A lot of people have passed, period. Have you ever heard anything? Voices, I mean? Gladys was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "I've worked nights here for 32 years. You hear things. Most of the time it's nothing. Just the building settling, or someone's TV down the hall, or your own mind playing tricks. But sometimes," she trailed off, shaking her head, "sometimes there's no explanation, and you learn not to look for one." She finished with my bandages and left before I could ask anything else, but her words stayed with me, circling in my head as the afternoon turned to evening and the evening turned to night. A lot of people have passed through here. A lot of people have passed. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't, even if I'd wanted to. I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening to every sound, waiting for the voice to come again. The hours crawled by, midnight, then 1 a.m., then 2. The hospital grew quieter, the footsteps in the hallway becoming less frequent, the murmur of voices fading to silence. At 3:17 a.m., I heard her. Robert. The same voice, the same gentle patience, calling a name the way you'd call someone you loved, someone you were waiting for. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Robert. I didn't know any Robert on this floor, but then I hadn't known Eleanor either. I pressed the call button. Marcus appeared a few minutes later, looking tired but alert. "Is there a patient named Robert on this floor?" I asked. He frowned. "Robert Chen, down in 412. Why? How is he? His condition, I mean." Marcus hesitated. Patient information wasn't something he was supposed to share, and I could see him weighing the rules against my obvious distress. "He's stable," he finally said. "Had a heart procedure yesterday. He's doing fine." Doing fine. But the voice had called his name. I didn't tell Marcus what I'd heard. Just thanked him, said I was having trouble sleeping, asked if there was anything they could give me to help. He brought me something mild and told me to try to rest. I took the pill and pretended to settle in, but I didn't close my eyes. I lay there for another hour, watching the clock, waiting. At 4:45 a.m., the monitors down the hall started screaming. "Code Blue, room 412. I heard them announce it, heard the thunder of running feet, heard the organized chaos of people trying to save a life. It went on for a long time, longer than Eleanor's had, longer than I would have thought possible. Then it stopped, and there was that terrible quiet that means the fight is over. Robert Chen, the man who'd been doing fine. I found out the details the next morning from a nurse who didn't know I'd been listening. Unexpected cardiac event. He'd been stable all day, all night, vitals strong, recovery on track. Then his heart just stopped. No warning, no gradual decline, nothing that should have predicted it. Nothing except a voice calling his name 2 hours before it happened. I was discharged that afternoon. Walked out of St. Catherine's on shaky legs, got into my car, drove home in a daze. I told myself I was done, that whatever was happening in that hospital wasn't my problem anymore, that I could go back to my normal life and forget any of this had ever happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, about its gentle patience, its quiet certainty. It wasn't warning the patients. They never seemed to hear it, never responded, never showed any sign that they knew their names were being called. It was calling for them, summoning them, and they answered, whether they knew it or not. I started researching St. Catherine's that week. Spent hours online, digging through local history archives, old newspaper articles, anything I could find about the hospital and its past. Most of it was mundane, funding drives, expansions, the usual life cycle of a medical institution. But buried in a community forum for local history enthusiasts, I found something that made my blood run cold. A thread from 2008 started by someone who'd worked at St. Catherine's in the 1970s. She described hearing a woman's voice in the Heritage Wing calling patients' names in the night. The patients whose names were called always died within hours, sometimes minutes. The voice had been documented by multiple staff members over the years, always the same. Soft, clear, patient. Like a nurse doing her rounds. except no nurse was ever there when the calls were heard, and no one could ever identify whose voice it was. The thread had 7 replies before it was abandoned. Most were dismissive, spooky story, fun for Halloween, probably just an urban legend. But one reply, from someone who'd worked there in the 1990s, said simply, "I heard it too. I quit the next day." I read that thread over and over, trying to convince myself it was fiction, trying to believe I hadn't heard exactly what they described. Then, my phone rang. It was the hospital, following up on my recovery. And in the background, barely audible, I heard that voice again. "Michael." My name. She was calling my name. I hung up the phone without saying anything. Just sat there in my living room, heart hammering, staring at the wall like it might have answers. The follow-up call had been routine, a recorded message asking me to rate my experience, to confirm my discharge instructions, to call back if I had any concerns. But underneath the automated voice, barely audible, that other voice had been there, calling my name the way she'd called Eleanor's, the way she'd called Robert's. I was going to die. That thought hit me like a physical blow, knocked the air out of my lungs, and left me gasping on my couch. Eleanor had died within hours of hearing her name. Robert had lasted maybe 2. And now the voice had called for me, had whispered my name through the static of a hospital phone line, and the clock was ticking. I called my doctor's office, left a frantic message saying I thought something was wrong, that I was having complications, that I needed to be seen immediately. They called back within the hour and told me to go to the emergency room if I was experiencing symptoms. I wasn't. Physically, I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. My incision was healing well. My pain was minimal. My vitals were perfect. But the voice had called my name. I went to the ER anyway, sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, then spent another 2 being examined by doctors who couldn't find anything wrong with me. They ran blood tests, did an EKG, checked my surgical site for signs of infection. Everything came back normal. The attending physician looked at me with that particular expression doctors get when they think a patient is wasting their time. "You're healthy," she said. "Whatever you're worried about, there's no medical basis for it." I couldn't tell her the truth. Couldn't explain that a ghost had whispered my name over the phone and I was waiting to drop dead. So I thanked her and left, stepping out into the parking lot with the strange, disorienting feeling of a condemned man who'd just been told his sentence was imaginary. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment with all the lights on, monitoring my own pulse, watching for any sign that my body was about to betray me. Every twinge of pain, every flutter of my heartbeat, every moment of dizziness sent me spiraling into panic. By morning, I was exhausted, wired, and no closer to dead than I'd been the day before. The voice had been wrong. That's what I told myself. Or maybe I'd misheard. Maybe it was just interference on the line. Maybe my traumatized brain had invented the sound of my own name because I was primed to hear it. I'd witnessed 2 deaths in 2 days, had discovered that the hospital was haunted or cursed or whatever you wanted to call it. Of course I was hearing things. Anyone would be. 3 days passed, then a week. I went back to work, went through the motions of my normal life, waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't. I stayed stubbornly, persistently alive, and with each passing day, the terror faded into something more manageable. A strange experience, a brush with the unexplainable, something I'd tell people about at parties, eventually, once enough time had passed to make it feel like a story instead of a trauma. Then I got the letter. It was from St. Catherine's, a bill for my hospital stay, itemized and detailed in that incomprehensible way medical billing always is. I almost threw it away without looking at it. But something made me stop, made me scan the pages, made me look at the dates and the charges and the notes in the margin. There was an entry I didn't recognize, a charge for a patient consultation on the night before I was discharged. The notation read, "Pastoral care visit, 3:24 a.m." I hadn't requested pastoral care. I wasn't religious, hadn't asked to see a chaplain, hadn't spoken to anyone in the middle of the night except Marcus when I'd called about the voice. But according to this bill, someone had visited my room at 3:24 a.m. Someone the hospital considered significant enough to document. I called the billing department, asked about the charge, asked who had visited me, asked for any information they could provide. The woman on the phone put me on hold for 15 minutes, then came back sounding confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no record of who made that visit. The charge was entered manually by someone on the 4th floor nursing staff, but there's no name attached to it." She paused. "That's unusual. I can remove the charge if you'd like." I didn't care about the charge. I cared about who had been in my room at 3:24 in the morning, documented but unnamed, visiting a patient who'd never asked to be visited. I drove back to St. Catherine's that afternoon, walked into the Heritage Wing like I belonged there, like I was just another visitor checking on a loved one. I found Marcus at the nurse's station, looking tired but pleased to see me. "Hey, you're looking good," he said. "Everything healing okay?" "I need to ask you something." I kept my voice low, aware of the other staff members nearby. "The night before I was discharged, who came to see me at 3:24 a.m.? Marcus frowned. "I was on shift that night. No one came to see you except me." "There's a charge on my bill. Pastoral care visit, 3:24 a.m. His frown deepened. He turned to his computer, typed something, scrolled through what looked like a patient log. After a minute, he shook his head. "There's nothing here. No record of anyone entering your room except nursing staff." He looked up at me, something flickering in his eyes. "Where did you see that charge?" I showed him the bill. He stared at it for a long time, his face going pale. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "We don't have pastoral care on the 4th floor at night. Haven't for years." He looked at me, and I saw fear in his expression, real fear, the kind that comes from confronting something you can't explain. The last chaplain who worked nights in this wing died in 1987. The floor tilted beneath me. "What was her name?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but Gladys might. She's been here since the building was new," I finished. "Yeah, she told me." I found Gladys in the break room, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback novel. She looked up when I walked in, and something in her face told me she'd been expecting this conversation. "You heard her, didn't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I heard her call my name." Gladys set down her sandwich. Her eyes were old, tired, filled with the weight of decades spent in this place. "Then you'd better sit down," she said, "because there's something you need to know." Gladys told me about Sister Mary Catherine. She'd been a nun before she was a nurse, joined the order at 18, served in a convent until her late 20s, then left to pursue medical training. The hospital had been affiliated with the Catholic Church back then, and Mary Catherine had seemed like a natural fit. She worked nights in what was then the long-term care ward, tending to patients who were too sick to go home but not sick enough to need constant monitoring, the ones who lingered. She had a gift, Gladys said. That's what everyone called it. She always knew when someone was close to the end, hours before, sometimes days. She'd sit with them, hold their hands, call their names so they wouldn't be alone when they passed. Gladys's voice was soft, reverent. In those days, people died in hospitals more often than they do now. Less technology, fewer interventions. Mary Catherine was there for hundreds of them, maybe thousands. What happened to her? Fire. Christmas Eve, 1987. Electrical fault in the old wiring. The whole Heritage Wing went up. Most of the patients were evacuated in time, but Mary Catherine went back in. She'd heard someone calling, a patient who'd been left behind, trapped in their room. She ran into the flames to save them. Gladys paused, and I saw her hands tremble slightly around her sandwich. They found her body the next morning. She'd made it to the room, but the ceiling had collapsed. She died holding the patient's hand. They went together. The break room felt cold. I could hear the hum of the vending machine, the distant beep of monitors down the hall, the ordinary sounds of a hospital going about its business. All of it felt very far away. "The voice I heard," I said. "That's her?" "That's what we think, those of us who've been here long enough to notice the pattern." Gladys met my eyes. She never stopped doing her job. Every night, she walks the halls, checking on patients, calling out to the ones who are close, making sure they're not alone when it's time. "But I didn't die." The words came out sharper than I intended. "She called my name and I'm still here. That doesn't fit the pattern." Gladys was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, measured. "You're not the first. Every few years, someone hears their name and survives. It's rare, but it happens." She leaned forward, her weathered face intent. "The way I understand it, and I've had a long time to think about this, Mary Catherine doesn't decide who dies. She just knows. She senses it somehow, the way she did when she was alive. But sometimes she's wrong. Or sometimes something changes. Changes how? I don't know. Maybe the person fights harder. Maybe medical intervention catches something in time. Maybe it's just not their moment after all." Gladys shrugged, a gesture that seemed too casual for the weight of what she was describing. "Mary Catherine calls the names she feels called to call. Most of the time she's right, but she's not infallible. She never was, even when she was alive." I thought about the ER visit, the doctors who'd found nothing wrong with me. The week I'd spent waiting to die, heart pounding at every flutter and twinge. Had something changed? Had my frantic rush to the hospital caught some invisible problem before it could kill me? Or had Mary Catherine simply been wrong about me? "Why can I hear her?" I asked. The other patients, Eleanor, Robert, they never seemed to know their names were being called, but I heard it clear as day. Gladys's expression shifted, became something harder to read. "That's the part I don't understand. Most people never hear her. They die peacefully, never knowing she was there. But a few, a very few, they hear everything. The calls, the footsteps, sometimes even her voice speaking to them directly." She paused. "The ones who hear her, they're usually what? Sensitive. Open to things other people aren't. Or they've been close to death themselves at some point in their lives. Near drowning, car accident, serious illness. Something that put them on the threshold, even if they came back." I felt a chill run down my spine. When I was 12, I'd fallen through the ice on a frozen pond. My father had pulled me out, blue-lipped and barely conscious, and I'd spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from hypothermia. The doctors had told my parents it was a miracle I'd survived. Maybe it wasn't a miracle. Maybe I'd just gotten close enough to whatever lay on the other side that I could still hear echoes of it 32 years later. "What do I do now?" I asked. "Just go home and pretend this never happened." Gladys studied me for a long moment. That's what most people do. The ones who hear her and survive, they leave and they don't come back. They try to forget and mostly they succeed. Life goes on. But some of them can't let it go. They need to understand, need to find some kind of closure. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's a woman. Heard Mary Catherine 20 years ago. Spent a long time trying to make sense of it. She doesn't work here anymore, but she still lives in town. Might be worth talking to her if you're the kind of person who needs answers." I took the paper. A name and phone number written in Gladys's careful handwriting. Patricia Vance. She was a nurse here? She was a patient, 17 years old, in for appendicitis. Heard her name called at 2 a.m. and spent the rest of the night convinced she was going to die. Gladys stood, gathering the remains of her lunch. She didn't, but she never forgot either. If anyone can help you make peace with this, it's her. I thanked Gladys and left the hospital, the piece of paper clutched in my hand like a lifeline. The afternoon sun was bright, The parking lot full of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, and I felt like I was walking between worlds. Part of me still here, in the land of the living. Part of me somewhere else, somewhere I'd glimpsed without meaning to, somewhere a dead nun walked the halls calling names that only the almost dead could hear. I sat in my car for a long time before I started the engine. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the paper. It rang 3 times before someone answered. Hello? A woman's voice, middle-aged, wary. Is this Patricia Vance? A pause. Who's asking? My name is Michael. Gladys gave me your number. She said you might be able to help me understand something that happened at St. Catherine's. Another pause, longer this time. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had changed. Softer, sadder, touched with something that might have been recognition. You heard her, she said. Didn't you? Yes. And you're still alive? Yes. I heard her exhale slowly, a sound that carried the weight of 2 decades of questions without answers. Come to my house, she said. We need to talk. Patricia Vance lived in a small craftsman bungalow on the east side of town, the kind of house that looked like it had been loved for generations. She met me at the door, a woman in her late 30s with graying hair and kind eyes that held something I recognized. The look of someone who'd seen something they couldn't explain and had spent years learning to live with it. She made tea. We sat in her living room, surrounded by books and houseplants and the quiet evidence of a life well lived. And then she told me her story. I was 17, she said. Burst appendix, emergency surgery, 3 days in the Heritage Wing recovering. The second night, I woke up to someone calling my name. Not my parents, not the nurses. A woman's voice, soft and patient, like she'd been waiting for me. She wrapped her hands around her mug, staring into the steam. I was terrified, convinced I was dying, that the surgery had gone wrong, that I was going to bleed out in that bed before anyone could save me. I called the nurses, made them run tests, made them check everything twice. They couldn't find anything wrong. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They thought I was hysterical. Teenage girl, post-surgery, probably just having a bad reaction to the anesthesia. But you knew it was real. I knew. And I spent the next 20 years trying to understand why. She set down her mug and looked at me directly. I researched Mary Catherine, talked to everyone who'd worked at St. Catherine's, anyone who might remember her. I found other survivors, people like us, who heard their names and lived. I interviewed them, collected their stories, tried to find the pattern. Did you? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Not a pattern, exactly. More like a theory. Something that makes sense to me, even if I can't prove it. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down a worn leather journal. She handed it to me, and I saw pages filled with handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, photographs of people I didn't recognize. Mary Catherine spent her whole life caring for the dying. She believed, truly believed, that no one should face death alone, that the moment of passing was sacred, and that having someone there to guide you through it made all the difference. Patricia sat back down, her voice soft. When she died in that fire, she was trying to save someone, trying to be there for them at the end, the way she'd been there for hundreds of others. And she's still doing it. She's still doing it, but she's not choosing who dies. That's not her role. She's just listening, sensing, the way she did when she was alive, only now she's not limited by a physical body. She can feel death approaching from further away, can sense it in people who don't even know they're in danger. I thought about Eleanor, about Robert, about myself, sitting in the ER while doctors searched for a problem that didn't exist. But she was wrong about me. Maybe, or maybe she wasn't. Patricia leaned forward. Here's what I think. Mary Catherine senses when someone is close to death, but close doesn't always mean certain. Some people are standing at the edge of a cliff they don't even know is there. A blood clot that hasn't moved yet. An arrhythmia that hasn't triggered. A weakness in a blood vessel that's about to give way. And hearing her name wakes them up, makes them pay attention. Patricia's eyes were intense now. You went to the ER after you heard your name. You made them run every test they could think of. Did they find anything at all? Anything they might have mentioned as a minor concern? I thought back to that frantic night. The EKG, the blood tests, the endless waiting. The attending physician had said I was healthy, but there had been something, a brief mention, almost an afterthought. My potassium was slightly elevated, I said slowly. They said it was probably nothing, probably just dehydration from the surgery. They gave me fluids and told me to follow up with my regular doctor. And did you? I had. A week later, still shaken, still convinced something was wrong. My doctor had run more tests, found that my potassium levels were still high, traced it to a medication interaction from my post-surgical prescriptions. She'd adjusted my medications and told me I was lucky we'd caught it. Left untreated, elevated potassium could cause cardiac arrest, just like Robert Chen. The realization hit me like cold water. I hadn't survived because Mary Catherine was wrong. I'd survived because she was right, and her call had frightened me enough to seek help before it was too late. She saved my life, I whispered. Maybe, or maybe you saved yourself, and she just pointed you in the right direction. Patricia smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. That's the thing about Mary Catherine. She's not a curse or a warning or a death sentence. She's what she always was, a caretaker, a guide, someone who shows up when you're close to the edge and makes sure you know you're not alone. I stayed at Patricia's house for another hour. We talked about life and death and the strange spaces in between. She showed me her research, her interviews with other survivors, her decades of trying to understand something that defied understanding. By the time I left, the sun was setting and I felt something I hadn't felt since I'd first heard that voice in my hospital room. Peace. I drive past St. Catherine's sometimes, see the Heritage Wing windows lit up at night, imagine the patients inside sleeping or healing or fighting battles I'll never know about, and I wonder if Mary Catherine is walking those halls right now, checking on her charges, calling out to the ones who are close. I don't hear her anymore. Whatever connection I had to that threshold, it seems to have faded. The near drowning when I was 12, the surgery at 34. Maybe those brushes with death opened a door that's slowly closing again. Maybe I'll hear her again someday, when I'm old and my own time is approaching. Maybe she'll call my name one more time, and this time, I'll know it's not a warning. It's an invitation. I'm not afraid of that anymore. Knowing that someone will be there, that I won't face that final moment alone, there's comfort in that. More comfort than I ever expected to find in a ghost story. If you ever find yourself in a hospital late at night and you hear a voice calling a name you don't recognize, don't dismiss it. Don't assume you're dreaming or drugged or losing your mind. Pay attention, listen. And if the voice calls your name, if you hear those syllables spoken with gentle patience in the darkness, don't be afraid. It doesn't necessarily mean you're dying. It might just mean someone is watching over you. Someone who's been doing this job for a very long time, who knows the territory between life and death better than anyone living ever could. She's not there to hurt you. She's there to help. And sometimes, if you're lucky, hearing her voice is exactly what you need to save yourself. Mary Catherine is still out there, walking the halls of St. Catherine's, doing the work she devoted her life to. I don't know if she's a ghost or an echo or something else entirely. I don't know if I believe in any of that, even now. But I believe she saved my life, and I'll be grateful for that voice in the darkness for as long as I live, however long that turns out to be. Story 5, The Slow Breathing from My Closet. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was the radiator. Old apartment, old building, old heating system that clanked and hissed and made all kinds of sounds I wasn't used to. I'd only been living there for 2 weeks, still learning the rhythms of the place, still figuring out which noises were normal and which ones meant something was wrong. So when I heard the slow, steady breathing coming from my closet at 3 a.m., I told myself it was just the pipes. I was 23, fresh out of college, working my first real job at a marketing agency downtown. The apartment was the cheapest thing I could find that wasn't a complete dump, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that didn't quite seal, and a closet in my bedroom that was deeper than it had any right to be. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, according to the landlord. Family emergency, had to break the lease early. He'd seemed almost too eager to rent to me, dropping the deposit and offering a month free if I signed that day. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. The closet was one of those old-fashioned ones with a heavy wooden door and a crystal doorknob that stuck sometimes when I tried to turn it. It ran the full depth of the bedroom, maybe 8 feet back, with a single bare bulb on a pull chain that cast harsh shadows over everything. I'd hung my clothes on the rod, stacked some boxes in the back, and thought nothing more about it. Until that first night when I woke up in the dark and heard something that wasn't the radiator. In, out, slow and steady, like someone sleeping, like someone right there in the room with me, close enough that I should have been able to feel their presence. I lay frozen in my bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before I could make myself move, then turned on every light in the apartment and searched everywhere. Under the bed, behind the shower curtain, in the closet, pushing aside clothes, moving boxes, checking every corner. Nothing, no one, just my own paranoid reflection in the dark window, pale and wide-eyed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Sat on my couch with a kitchen knife on the cushion next to me, watching the bedroom doorway, waiting for something to emerge. By the time the sun came up, I felt ridiculous, overtired, overstressed, hearing things that weren't there. First apartment jitters. It happened to everyone. A week passed without incident. I started sleeping normally again, started forgetting about the breathing, started settling into my new life. The job was demanding, the commute was long, and by the time I got home each night, I was too exhausted to worry about phantom sounds in the dark. Then I noticed the clothes. It was a small thing at first, a blouse that I could have sworn I'd hung on the left side of the closet, now hanging on the right. A pair of jeans folded on the shelf when I always draped them over hangers. The kind of details you notice subconsciously but dismiss because the alternative is too unsettling to consider. But then I found the wrapper. It was crammed behind one of my boxes in the back of the closet, a granola bar wrapper, crumpled and empty. Not a brand I bought, not something I'd ever eaten. Just sitting there in the dark, evidence of someone else's hunger. I stood there, staring at it for a long time. The closet suddenly felt different, not just deep, but cavernous, full of shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I thought about the breathing, thought about the clothes that had moved, thought about how eager my landlord had been to rent this place, how quickly the previous tenant had left. Someone had been in my closet. Someone might still be in my closet. I called my friend David, my voice shaking so badly he could barely understand me. He came over within the hour, a baseball bat in one hand and a flashlight in the other. We searched the apartment together, every inch of it, starting with the closet and working outward. We found nothing. No one hiding, no signs of entry, no explanation for the wrapper or the moved clothes or the breathing I'd heard in the night. Maybe the last tenant left it, David suggested. The wrapper, I mean. Maybe it's been there for months and you just didn't notice. I wanted to believe him. It was a reasonable explanation, far more reasonable than the alternative. The previous tenant had left in a hurry after all, probably left all kinds of things behind. But the wrapper hadn't been dusty. It had been clean, fresh, like someone had eaten that granola bar in the last few days. And my clothes had definitely moved. I was sure of it now, running through my mental inventory, remembering exactly where I'd put things and noticing how they'd changed. David offered to stay the night. I almost said yes, but pride or stupidity or something in between made me refuse. I was an adult, living on my own, and I wasn't going to be scared out of my apartment by a candy wrapper and an overactive imagination. After he left, I pushed my dresser in front of the closet door, wedged it tight against the frame so that nothing could open that door without making noise. Then I went to bed with my phone in my hand and the kitchen knife on my nightstand, telling myself I was being ridiculous, telling myself there was nothing to be afraid of. At 2:47 a.m., I woke to the sound of the dresser moving. Just an inch, just a scrape of wood against wood, barely audible in the silence of the apartment. I held my breath, watching the closet door in the faint glow of the streetlight through my window. The dresser shifted again, pushed from the other side, and through the crack between the door and the frame, I saw something move. Something that hadn't been there when I'd searched the closet hours earlier. Something that was looking back at me. I didn't scream. Some part of my brain, the part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years before we had locks and lights and cell phones, knew that screaming would be the wrong move. Prey doesn't announce itself. Prey stays silent and still and waits for its chance to run. The dresser shifted again, another inch, maybe two. Through the widening crack, I could see more of what was behind it. A shape, dark against the darker closet interior, pressed up against the door. Not a shadow, not my imagination, a person. I grabbed my phone and my knife and I ran. Out of the bedroom, through the living room, out the front door without stopping for shoes or a jacket or anything except escape. I made it to the stairwell before I heard my apartment door slam open behind me, before I heard footsteps, heavy, fast, following me down the stairs. I didn't look back. I just ran, 3 flights down and out the building's entrance and into the street, screaming now because I was outside, because people could hear me, because I wasn't prey anymore. A couple walking their dog stopped and stared. A car slowed down. Someone asked if I was okay, and I couldn't answer, couldn't do anything except point at my building and gasp out the words, "Someone's in my apartment. Someone was in my closet." The police came, 2 officers, then 4, then a whole team that swarmed through my building like they were expecting an armed standoff. I sat in the back of a cruiser, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. The couple with the dog had stayed with me, the woman holding my hand and telling me it was going to be okay, that I was safe now. It took almost an hour before a detective came to talk to me. Her name was Morrison, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she'd seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. "We found evidence that someone was living in your closet," she said. "For a while, by the looks of it. Living, not hiding, living. There's a false panel in the back wall," she continued. "It opens into a space between your apartment and the one next door, probably part of the original construction, walled off during renovations. Someone's been using it as a residence." I thought I might throw up. How long? Hard to say for certain. But based on what we found, food wrappers, water bottles, a sleeping bag, at least a few weeks, maybe longer. She paused. "Did you notice anything before tonight? Anything that seemed off?" I told her about the breathing, about the clothes, about the granola bar wrapper I'd found just that afternoon. Her expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or something worse. "The previous tenant," I said. "The one who left in a hurry. Did something happen to her?" Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment. She filed a report similar to yours about 3 months ago. Sounds, objects moving, the feeling of being watched. We searched the apartment but didn't find anything. She moved out a week later, said she couldn't sleep there anymore. 3 months. This person had been in the walls for at least 3 months, watching 2 different women, waiting in the dark while they slept. The previous tenant hadn't imagined it. She'd just been lucky enough, or smart enough, to leave before anything happened. "Did you catch him?" I asked. "The person in the closet?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "He wasn't there when we arrived." The space behind the panel connects to the building's old servant passages. He could have exited through multiple points. Gone. He was gone, out there somewhere in the city, and I had no idea what he looked like or where he might go next. They took me to the station to give a formal statement. I spent hours in an interview room, going over every detail I could remember, every sound, every moved object, every moment that had felt wrong but that I dismissed as paranoia. By the time I was done, the sun was coming up and I felt hollowed out, empty of everything except exhaustion and fear. David picked me up from the station. He didn't say I told you so, didn't say anything at all, just drove me to his apartment and set me up on his couch with a pillow and blankets, and a promise that he'd be right there if I needed anything. I slept for 14 hours straight, a dreamless void that felt like the only mercy the universe had left to offer. When I woke up, I had 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Friends who'd seen the news, family who'd heard through the grapevine, co-workers who couldn't believe what had happened. The story had made the local papers. Intruder found living in woman's closet wall. They didn't use my name, but they didn't have to. Everyone who knew me knew it was my apartment, my closet, my nightmare. I never went back. Sent David and a moving company to pack up my things, instructed them to throw away anything from the closet, all of it, every piece of clothing he might have touched, every box he might have moved. I couldn't stand the thought of wearing something he'd handled, of keeping anything that had been in that space with him. The police kept me updated on the investigation. They'd found fingerprints in the hidden room, had matched them to a man named Warren Suttles, 41 years old, no fixed address, a history of arrests for trespassing and voyeurism. He'd been doing this for years, they told me, finding old buildings with hidden spaces, moving in like a ghost, watching the people who lived there without their knowledge. Watching. That was the word that stuck with me. Not hurting, not attacking, not doing anything that would register as violent crime. Just watching. Standing in the dark on the other side of a thin panel of wood, listening to me sleep, waiting for something that only he understood. They hadn't caught him yet. Warren Suttles was still out there, still looking for his next hiding place, his next unknowing host. And I was left wondering how many nights he'd stood in that closet, breathing slowly in the dark, watching me through some crack I'd never even noticed. I moved in with David for 3 weeks while I looked for a new apartment. He never complained, never made me feel like a burden, but I could see the worry in his eyes every time he looked at me. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating much, spent most of my time scrolling through apartment listings and eliminating anything in an old building, anything with closets, anything that reminded me even slightly of the place I'd fled. I found a studio in a new construction high-rise downtown. Modern, minimal, no hidden spaces, no old walls with secrets behind them. The closet was just a closet, shallow, well-lit, with sliding doors that couldn't hide anything larger than a coat. I paid first and last month's rent without negotiating, signed the lease the same day, and moved in with nothing but a suitcase of new clothes and a mattress on the floor. For 2 weeks, I almost felt normal. The new apartment had none of the creaks and groans of the Victorian. No radiators that could be mistaken for breathing. No shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I started sleeping through the night again, started eating regular meals, started believing that maybe I could put this behind me. Then the police called. Detective Morrison's voice was careful, controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to alarm you. "We found Warren Suttles," she said. "He was picked up in another city, about 200 miles from here. He'd been living in the walls of another apartment building. Same pattern, same setup. I should have felt relieved. He was caught, locked up, no longer a threat. But something in her voice told me there was more. When we searched his belongings, we found some things we need to discuss with you." A pause. "Can you come down to the station?" I went that afternoon, sat in the same interview room where I'd given my statement weeks earlier, across from Detective Morrison and a folder she hadn't opened yet. "Warren Suttles has been doing this for over a decade," she said. We've connected him to at least 7 buildings, possibly more. He targets old Victorian conversions specifically. They're more likely to have hidden spaces, servant passages, construction quirks that create voids in the walls. You said you found things in his belongings. Morrison nodded slowly. She opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was me, sleeping in my bed, taken from above, the angle suggesting whoever held the camera had been standing directly over me. My face was slack, peaceful, completely unaware of the person inches away. The timestamp in the corner showed a date 3 days before I'd heard the breathing for the first time. "There are more," Morrison said quietly. "Dozens, going back to your first week in the apartment." I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing closer, and I understood with horrible clarity that the breathing in the night hadn't been the beginning. He'd been there from the start, watching me sleep, taking photographs, standing so close he could have touched me. He also had this. Morrison slid another item across the table, a photocopy of a document. It took me a moment to recognize it. My lease application, my name, my previous address, my employer, my emergency contacts, everything someone would need to find me again. Where did he get this? We don't know. Possibly from your landlord's files, possibly from your mailbox. He had similar documents for the previous tenant as well. Morrison's eyes met mine. The reason I'm telling you this is that we found evidence he was researching new locations before he was arrested, including... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. My new building. We don't have proof that he ever went there, but your new address was in his notes, along with the building's floor plans and a highlighted section that appears to indicate potential access points. The studio that felt so safe, so clean, so modern. He'd already been looking for ways inside. If he hadn't been caught when he was, he might have found one. Is he going to stay in jail? My voice came out steadier than I felt. He's being charged in multiple jurisdictions. The photographs alone are enough for serious voyeurism charges, and there's evidence linking him to the previous buildings as well. He's looking at years, potentially decades. Morrison leaned forward. But I won't lie to you. People like this, they don't stop. They get released eventually, and when they do, they go right back to what they were doing. You need to be prepared for that. Prepared. How do you prepare for someone who lives in walls? Someone who can look at a building and see the spaces between spaces, the gaps where a person could exist unseen. I went home that night, if you could call it home, and searched my apartment with a flashlight, running my hands along every wall, checking every seam and corner. The building was new construction, concrete and steel, no old passages, no hidden rooms. There was nowhere for anyone to hide, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that somewhere, in some crack I hadn't found yet, someone was watching. I started sleeping with the lights on, started putting tape over every vent, every gap, every opening larger than a quarter. My friends thought I was being paranoid, that I needed to let go and move on, that Warren Suttles was behind bars and I was safe now. They didn't understand. Safety was an illusion. It had always been an illusion. I'd spent weeks sleeping 10 feet away from a man in my walls, completely unaware, completely vulnerable. The fact that he was caught didn't change what he'd done. Didn't change the photographs, the watching, the nights he'd stood over my bed while I dreamed. I'd never feel safe again, and part of me knew I was right not to, because Warren Suttles wasn't unique. He was just the one who got caught. 3 months after Warren's arrest, another victim found me. Her name was Jenna, and she'd lived in one of the other buildings he'd infiltrated, a brownstone conversion in a neighborhood about 20 miles from mine. She'd tracked me down through social media, piecing together details from the news coverage until she figured out who I was. Her message was short. I know what you're going through. If you want to talk, I'm here. I almost didn't respond. Part of me wanted to leave this whole nightmare behind, to stop thinking about Warren Suttles and hidden spaces and the sound of slow breathing in the dark. But a larger part, The part that still couldn't sleep without the lights on, that still checked the walls every time I came home, needed to know I wasn't alone. We met at a coffee shop in a neutral part of the city. Jenna was a few years older than me, early 30s, with the same haunted look in her eyes that I saw every morning in my mirror. We talked for 4 hours. She told me about her apartment, the sounds she'd heard, the things she'd dismissed until it was almost too late. Her story was so similar to mine, it felt like listening to an echo. He was in my walls for almost 5 months, she said. I found out later that he'd been watching my boyfriend and me, together. He had photographs of everything. The violation in her voice was something I understood completely. Not just the fear, but the contamination of it. The knowledge that your most private moments had been witnessed by someone who had no right to see them. "Have you talked to the prosecutor?" I asked. Jenna nodded. "They want us all to testify, everyone he targeted, if they're willing. They're building a case for the maximum sentence. All of us." I hadn't thought about the other victims as a group, as people with faces and names and stories like mine, but there were at least 7 buildings, possibly more. 7 women, or more, who'd lived with a stranger in their walls. I called the prosecutor's office the next day, told them I wanted to help, wanted to testify, wanted to do whatever it took to make sure Warren Suttles never got the chance to do this again. They scheduled me for a preparation meeting, walked me through what the trial would look like, warned me that his defense would try to minimize what he'd done. "They're going to argue that he never touched anyone," the prosecutor told me. That watching isn't the same as assault, that the photographs were for personal use, not distribution. They'll try to paint him as a troubled man with a compulsion, not a predator. He stood over my bed while I slept. I know, and we're going to make sure the jury understands exactly what that means. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out. 6 months of waiting, of preparing, of trying to hold my life together while the legal system slowly ground toward justice. I threw myself into work, into exercise, into anything that could distract me from the constant low hum of anxiety that had become my baseline state. Jenna and I stayed in touch. She connected me with 2 other victims, a woman named Diane, who'd lived in Warren's first known building almost a decade ago, and a younger woman, barely 20, who'd moved into her apartment just 3 months before Warren was caught. We formed a strange sort of support group, bound together by an experience none of us had asked for, and none of us could fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Diane was the one who told me about Warren's journal. The police had found it in his belongings, buried among the photographs and floor plans and lease applications. Hundreds of pages, going back years, documenting his observations in meticulous detail. What his targets wore, what they ate, who they talked to on the phone, the sounds they made in their sleep. "He gave us names," Diane said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone who'd long since burned through their capacity for shock. Pet names, like we were his collection. I felt sick. What did he call me? I don't know. I only saw excerpts from the prosecution's discovery documents. She paused. "Do you really want to know?" I didn't, but I needed to. Needed to understand who this man was, what had driven him, why he'd chosen to live in the spaces between other people's lives. The prosecutor showed me the relevant pages at our next meeting. Warren had called me Songbird. He'd noted that I hummed to myself when I was alone, that I sang in the shower, that my voice was pure and unguarded when I thought no one was listening. He'd written about the pleasure of hearing me through the thin wall of the closet, the intimacy of sounds I never knew I was sharing. Reading his words felt like being violated all over again. He'd taken something from me that I hadn't even known I was giving, the small, private moments of my daily life, the songs I'd sung without thinking, the unconscious sounds of simply existing in what I'd believed was my own space. "He's never going to stop," I said. "Even if you lock him up for 20 years, he'll get out and he'll find another building, another woman, another wall to hide behind." The prosecutor didn't disagree. That's why we need the jury to understand exactly who he is. Not a peeping Tom, not a harmless eccentric. A predator who spent a decade perfecting his methods, who violated dozens of women in the most intimate ways possible without ever leaving a mark they could point to. The trial date approached. I prepared my testimony, rehearsed my answers, steeled myself for the moment when I'd have to sit in a courtroom and describe the worst experience of my life while Warren Suttles watched, because he would watch. I knew that now. Watching was what he did, what he'd always done. Even sitting at the defendant's table in handcuffs, he would be watching me, studying me, adding to whatever mental catalog he'd built during all those nights in my closet. And I would have to let him, would have to sit there and be seen, be examined, be watched one more time, because that was the price of making sure he never did this to anyone else. I told myself I was ready. I told myself I could handle it. I had no idea. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Somehow I'd imagined something grand, something that matched the weight of what we were there to discuss. Instead, it was just a room. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, rows of uncomfortable wooden benches filled with strangers who'd come to watch other people's worst moments become public record. Warren Suttles sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit that made him look almost ordinary. Average height, average build, thinning brown hair combed neatly to one side. If I'd passed him on the street, I wouldn't have looked twice. That was the most terrifying thing about him, how completely unremarkable he appeared. No visible sign of the predator underneath. He watched me as I walked to the witness stand. Not staring, not glaring, just watching. The same patient, attentive gaze he must have used all those nights in my closet, studying me through whatever gap he'd found in the wall. I felt it on my skin like something physical, like fingers trailing across the back of my neck. I told my story. All of it, from the first night I heard the breathing to the moment I saw his eyes through the crack in the door. I described the photographs the police had found, the journal entries where he'd named me Songbird, the meticulous documentation of my private life. My voice shook sometimes, but I didn't stop. I'd promised myself I wouldn't stop. His defense attorney tried to minimize everything, just like the prosecutor had warned. He suggested that Warren had never intended any harm, that watching wasn't the same as touching, that whatever psychological issues drove his behavior should be treated with sympathy rather than punishment. He asked me if Warren had ever actually hurt me. He stood over my bed while I slept, I said. He photographed me in my most vulnerable moments. He took away my ability to feel safe in my own home. I looked directly at Warren for the first time since taking the stand. The fact that he didn't leave bruises doesn't mean he didn't hurt me, Jenna testified. So did Diane, and the young woman whose name I'd learned was Catalina. One by one, we told our stories, painting a picture of a man who had spent a decade perfecting the art of violation without contact. The jury listened. Some of them looked sick. One woman in the back row was crying by the time Catalina finished describing how Warren had documented her first intimate relationship, photographing her and her boyfriend through a hole he'd drilled in their bedroom ceiling. The deliberation took 2 days. I spent them in a hotel room near the courthouse, unable to eat, barely able to sleep, refreshing my phone every few minutes for updates that didn't come. Jenna stayed with me. We didn't talk much. There wasn't anything left to say. Guilty. All counts. The word came through like a thunderclap, breaking something loose in my chest that had been clenched tight for over a year. Guilty of voyeurism, guilty of stalking, guilty of breaking and entering, guilty of invasion of privacy in 7 separate jurisdictions. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out, and the prosecutor told us it would be significant. Warren got 23 years, no possibility of parole for at least 15. I watched his face when the sentence was read. For just a moment, that mask of ordinary blandness slipped, and I saw something underneath. Not remorse, not fear, but frustration, annoyance, like a collector whose prized possessions had been confiscated, who couldn't understand why no one else appreciated what he'd built. That expression haunts me more than anything else, more than the photographs, more than the journal, more than the memory of his eyes through the crack in my closet door. because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. In his mind, he was an observer, an archivist, someone who appreciated women in ways they'd never understand. Prison wouldn't change that. Nothing would. It's been 2 years since the trial. Warren Suttles is still behind bars, and if the system works the way it's supposed to, he will be for another 13 years at minimum. I get notifications when anything changes in his case. I've memorized his release date the way some people memorize anniversaries. I don't live in the high-rise anymore. Too sterile, too anonymous, too many units with too many people I didn't know. I bought a small house in the suburbs. New construction, single story, no closets deeper than 3 feet. I had a contractor come through before I moved in and verify that there were no hidden spaces, no voids in the walls, no gaps where a person could exist unseen. He probably thought I was crazy. I didn't care. I still checked the walls. Every night, before I go to bed, I walk through my house and run my hands along the surfaces, looking for seams that shouldn't be there. I tap on the drywall, listening for hollow sounds. I check the closets with a flashlight, move the clothes aside, make sure I'm really alone. My therapist says this is a normal response to trauma, that hypervigilance is the brain's way of trying to prevent the same thing from happening again. She says it will fade eventually, that I'll learn to trust my environment, that I won't always live like someone expecting the walls to open up and swallow me. I want to believe her. Some days I almost do. Here's what I need you to understand. The person living in your walls might not exist. Probably doesn't exist. The sounds you hear at night are almost certainly pipes or radiators or the building settling. The objects that seem to move are just your memory playing tricks on you. But almost certainly isn't the same as definitely. And probably isn't the same as can't. Check your closets. Really check them. Not just a glance, but a thorough search. Look for panels that don't quite match, seams that seem newer than the rest, gaps that could hide something you don't want to find. Know the dimensions of your rooms. Know where the walls should be. And if you ever hear breathing in the darkness, slow and steady like someone sleeping, don't tell yourself it's the radiator. Turn on the lights, open the door, find out for certain. Because the alternative is lying there in the dark, convincing yourself you're imagining things, while someone on the other side of a thin sheet of wood listens to you breathe and waits. I know how that story ends. I almost lived it. Don't let yourself become another entry in someone's journal. Don't let yourself become someone's songbird. Check the walls.